before it's dark, but no, I think we should, because we got the budget tonight. The first order of business is approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion and a second for approval of the agenda?
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved by Wolf and seconded by Lilligren. Approval of agenda. Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is adopted. Okay, approval of minutes. Next order of business is approval of the minutes from the July 24th meeting. Can I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Bento and seconded by Lindstrom. Approval of the minutes. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion is adopted. And that brings us to the point in the meeting where members of the public who wish to address the council on matters not on the agenda may do so. So are there anybody that signed up? No. No, okay. So we did not have anybody who signed up. Just a reminder to the public, we did have somebody send an email, but you really have to give your email to someone that is here or ask for it to be read. If I think, is that the process to the regional administrator?
Madam Chair, I don't know that that has come up much before. Typically, people send it with someone else in their organization, and so I guess if a council member wanted to read it on their behalf, they could, but that is not something we formally declared in the past.
So just a reminder, you really need to come in person, ideally, is the way we prefer that. So there is nobody here for the public invitation. That brings us to business. Our next order of business is the joint reports from the Transportation, Environment, Community Development, and Management Committees. So Councilmember Ferguson, I understand that it will be you.
So our first item for business is, as long as I got them in the right order, 2019-196, International Union of Pipe Fitters Union.
Oh,
The budget
amendments.
Budget
Yeah,
amendments.
sorry.
gotta find the right page, I understand.
Yep, 166.
So 2019-166.
166, all right.
Joint
Yeah, that's
SW.
So joint SW 2019 budget amendment, second quarter community development.
Oh,
We're not having
okay. We're just having a debate about the consent agenda, but the way that it reads is we're doing the business items first. And so it's a little bit different tonight. So good point. Sorry, Councilmember Barber.
Madam Chair, often with the budget amendments like this, because they're roll call votes, they're done early in the meeting and then followed by the consent agenda.
Okay.
It's not unusual.
Okay. I think that's the first time we've had that though for this council. So, okay, thank you, Councilmember Ferguson.
So it's business item 2019-166, same week. 2019 budget amendment, second quarter community development. The second quarter unified budget amendment includes an amendment to the capital budget. The capital program includes the closing of completed projects and moving funding for projects from the planned CIP to the authorized capital program. This item has been reviewed and approved by the Management Committee and the Community Development Committee. Mr. Chair, or Ms. Chair, sorry, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorizes the 2019 unified budget as indicated in accordance with the attached tables.
Okay, there is a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. It's been moved by Ferguson and seconded by Sterner. Item number 20. Okay. Remember, item number 2019-166 JTSW. And just so you know, there will be a roll call on this vote because it's a budget amendment. And so I will ask Liz to call the roll.
Councilmember Johnson, Councilmember Chambliss, Councilmember Ferguson,
Aye.
Councilmember Barber,
Aye.
Councilmember Cummings,
Aye.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson,
She's running late. Oh, wait, okay.
Councilmember Lindgren,
Aye.
Councilmember Mousse, Councilmember Zurin,
Aye.
Councilmember Lindstrom,
Aye.
Councilmember Bento,
Aye.
Councilmember Gonzalez,
Aye.
Councilmember Lee, Councilmember Fredson,
Aye.
Councilmember Sterner,
Aye.
Councilmember Wolf,
Aye.
and Chair Slot.
Aye. So hearing ayes, and then we have some folks that are absent, so those are the ones that were called where there was no answer. So people are wondering what happened. So the motion carries. So that brings us next to 2019-187, JT. I think this is also Councilmember Ferguson.
2019-187, 2019 budget amendment for the second quarter for transportation. The second quarter unified budget amendment includes an amendment to both the operating and capital budgets. The operating budget reflects the changes from the 2019 legislative session of the new base funding for Metro Mobility and for transit system operations. The operating budget also reflects the 2019 Operation Lifesaver Competitive Rail Safety Education Grant and the equal dollar exchange of MVST funds and federal funds between the capital and operating budgets. The capital program includes the closing of completed projects and moving funding from projects from the planned CIP to the authorized capital program. This item has been reviewed and approved by the Management Committee and the Transportation Committee. Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorizes the 2019 unified budget as indicated in accordance with the attached tables.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. So I will say there's a motion by Councilmember Ferguson, seconded by Councilmember Sterner on item number 2019-187 JT. Liz, please call the roll.
Okay. Councilmember Johnson, Councilmember Chambliss, Councilmember Ferguson,
Aye.
Councilmember Barber,
Aye.
Councilmember Cummings,
Aye.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson, Councilmember Lilligren,
Aye.
Councilmember Musse, Councilmember Zurin,
Aye.
Councilmember Lindstrom,
Aye.
Councilmember Vento,
Aye.
Councilmember Gonzalez,
Aye.
Councilmember Lee, Councilmember Fredson,
Aye.
Councilmember Sterner,
Aye.
Councilmember Wolf,
Aye.
and Chair Slow.
Aye. And ayes, the motion is carried. Next, we will move to the consent agenda. And I have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Vento and seconded by Lindstrom, approval of the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. Hearing none, the motion is carried. Thank you. And next, we're going to hear from the standing committees. Councilmember Lilligren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Community Development Committee brings 3 comprehensive plans for consideration this evening. The first is 2019-215. It's the City of Coates 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Coates is located in central Dakota County, and through 2040, Thrive does not forecast any growth for the community of 170 people and 70 households. Thrive identifies the city as diversified rural community. The city is not connected to the regional wastewater system and is served entirely by private septic systems. Council staff found that the city's 2040 plan conforms to regional systems plans, is consistent with the council policies, and is compatible with the plans of the adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council adopt the attached advisory comments and review record and take the following actions. First, authorize the City of Coates to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, and also to advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record per local water management plan.
Thank you. There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. It's been moved by Lilligren and seconded by Wolf. Item number 2019-2015. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. The motion is carried. Your next item?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next item is 2019-216. It's the City of Meesville 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The City of Meesville is located in Dakota County. It's completely surrounded by Douglas Township. Through 2040, Thrive forecasts the addition of 10 jobs and no growth in households or population for this city of 113 residents. Thrive identifies the city as a diversified rural community, and the city is not connected to the regional wastewater system and is served entirely by private septic systems. Council staff found that the city's 2040 plan conforms to regional systems plans, is consistent with council policies, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Therefore, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council adopt the attached advisory comments and review record and take the following actions. Authorize the city of Meesville to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect and advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record for transportation and water supply. And Madam Chair, I would also note that during the Community Development Committee, Councilmember Wolf gave us some excellent restaurant tips out in both of these small
Nice.
communities in her district. Yes, thank you.
Excellent. So there is a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Lilligren and seconded by Councilmember Wolf. Item number 2019-216. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. Okay, your next item?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next item is business item 2019-217. It's authorization of the City of Trier 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The City of Trier is in Dakota County and completely surrounded by Hampton Township. Through 2040, Thrive forecasts the addition of 10 jobs and minimal growth in households or population for the city of 140 residents. Thrive identifies the city as diversified rural community, and the city is not connected to the regional wastewater system and is served entirely by private septic systems. My council staff found that the city's 2040 plan confirms to regional systems plans, is consistent with the council policies, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council adopt the attached advisory comments and review record and authorize the city of New Trier to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect and advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record for local water management plan.
Okay, so there is a motion by Councilmember Lilligren. Is there a second?
Second.
It's seconded by Councilmember Wolf. Item number 2019-217. Maybe on the restaurant reviews, you could email them out or something so we can see those. That'd be interesting. It's not that far, right? And big metro area. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have environment. So I understand your reports were on consent?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Lindstrom. Management, Councilmember Ferguson.
So we have one business item, 2019-196, International Union of Pipe Fitters, local number 455, AFL-CIO. The Metropolitan Council has a labor agreement with the International Union of Pipe Fitters, local 455, which expired on April 30th, 2019. The union represents one full-time pipe fitter who performs licensed maintenance work for the Council's Environmental Services Division. The union and the Council reached a tentative agreement on July 2nd, 2019, which was ratified by the membership on July 8th, 2019. Highlights of the agreement include a 3-year contract effective May 1st, 2019 to April 29th, 2022, a $2.25 per hour increase in year 1, $2.50 per hour increase in years 2 and 3, and total wages and benefits package, which per council policy follows the outside agreement negotiated between Local 455 and representatives of the local construction industry. In 2019, the total package will be $75.26 per hour. Council trades employees receive all health and welfare benefits through their union. Total package includes payments for all wages and benefits of the employee, including health insurance, pension contributions, and time off. Cost of the labor agreement was reviewed by finance and negotiated within the economic parameters established by the council. The item was reviewed and approved by the Management Committee on July 4th, 2019. Madam Chair, the Management Committee moves approval to authorize the regional administrator to enter into the labor agreement with the International Union of Pipe Fitters, local number 455, AFL-CIO, effective May 1st, 2019 through April 30th, 2022.
Okay, thank you. There is a motion by Councilmember Ferguson. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Barber. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Okay. Any opposed? Okay. Seeing none, the motion is carried. Thank you.
Madam Chair, could I just make one other comment on an item that
Sure,
came before us?
Councilmember
So
Ferguson.
I think, as many of you know, we've been working a lot on the MCUB. We had a great presentation today from our procurement department and Office of OEO. And we had, from Q1 to Q2, we had a 246% increase in spend with MCUB vendors. And I think it's important to recognize that department for the work that they've done and the work that they've been doing throughout the entire council and encouraging people to make those different choices in spend. And we just approved a contract today with another MCO vendor for about $3 million, which will significantly increase our numbers over the last half of the year. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge the great work that the department's been doing and the progress that we've seen in a very quick period of time. So.
Yeah, thank you. I see the staff is out there, so thank you, and you and your department, and thanks for recognizing them. Councilmember Ferguson, I think that everybody kind of has their specialty, and this is something. I think it's really good that you are tracking this and keeping track of it and keeping the council informed. So I appreciate that. Next, we have Transportation, Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two business items to come before you tonight. So the first one, Madam Chair and council members, is business item number 2019-193, is regarding the approval to exercise option year 6 of the current Metro Mobility East Zone contract with First Transit, extending and funding the contract through August 31st, 2021. Metro Mobility service area is divided into 3 geographic zones, Metro West, Metro East, and Metro South, that are served by 3 providers under separate contract. In 2015, the Metropolitan Council approved the action to authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute each of these contracts with a 5-year term and an option to extend by 1 year. In order to best manage the procurement and service transition of their 3 largest service contracts, Metro Mobility plans to stagger the termination dates and issue requests for proposal for next contracts to begin on a staggered implementation schedule. The Metro Mobility East Zone contract initiated in August 2015. While sufficient funds remain in the existing authorization to operate services through year 5 of the contract, additional funds are needed to extend the contract through year 6. Therefore, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to exercise optional year 6 in the Metro Mobility Demand East Zone contract 14P109 with First Transit and increase the maximum contract amount by amount not to exceed $24,395,837.
There is a motion by Councilmember Barber. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Cummings. And it's a race sometimes, so
Oh, yeah.
that was my hearing. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Next is your next item.
Madam Chair, council members, business item number 2019-222 is a same week item regarding the approval to execute a grant amendment with the state of Minnesota. Metro Transit is the recipient of grant funding from the Minnesota Apprenticeship Initiative from the state of Minnesota for the Bus Operator Apprenticeship Program. The Bus Operator Apprenticeship Program is a second-in-the-nation program to mentor new bus operators during their critical first year on the job. The original grant authorized up to $500,000 for reimbursable expenses. At this time, the grant has paid approximately $435,000 to Metro Transit for eligible expenses, primarily training. This amendment will allow for additional grant funds up to $500,000 to be collected by Metro Transit. Therefore, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to execute grant amendment Metro 2018 MAI with the state of Minnesota.
There's a motion by Councilmember Barber. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, now it's on.
Arm
With
wrestling.
Councilmember Sterner this time is for the second on item 2019-222 South SW. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. Next, we have the joint report of Environment and Community Development Committees, and that is done by Councilmember Lilligren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next 2 comprehensive plans are from communities that are not connected to the that are connected to the regional wastewater system. So they were heard on both community development and the environment committees. The first is business item 2019-198 JT. It is the 2040 comprehensive plan of the city of Excelsior. Excelsior is located in Lake Minnetonka in Hennepin County and surrounded by Greenwood and Shorewood. Staff council recommended adjusting near-term forecast numbers to reflect a housing project under construction. With the revised forecasts in the near term, the city is forecasted to grow between 2020 and 2040 by 50 people, 30 households, and 200 jobs. Thrive identifies the city as a suburban community. Council staff found that the city's 2040 plan conforms to regional regional systems plans, is consistent with council policies, and is compatible with the plans of the adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council adopt the attached advisory comments and review record and take the following actions. From Community Development Committee, authorize the City of Excelsior to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect. Also revise the city's forecast upwards as shown in Table 1 of the review record. Also revise the city's affordable housing allocation to 12 units as described in the review record, and advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record for surface water management and water supply, and from the Environment Committee to approve the City of Excelsior's comprehensive sewer plan.
Thank you. There is a motion by Councilmember Lilligren. Is there a second?
Second.
And a second by Councilmember Ferguson. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion of 2019-198 JT is passed. Councilmember Lilligren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next business item is 2019-199. It is the authorization of the 2040 comprehensive plan for the city of West St. Paul. The city of West St. Paul is located in northern Dakota County. It's surrounded by the communities of St. Paul, South St. Paul, Inga Grove Heights, Sunfish Lake, and Mendota Heights. Thrive forecasts growth of 2,300 new households in the community through 2040. Thrive MSP 2040 designates West St. Paul as city urban center. The city's plan appropriately guides land densities and is in patterns consistent with the designation of suburban community designation land use policies. Council staff find that the city's 2040 plan conforms to regional systems plans, is consistent with council policies, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council adopt the attached advisory comments and review record and take the following actions from Community Development Committee. Authorize the City of West St. Paul to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, and also to advise the city to provide the council the date the city adopted the final local water management plan when it's available. And from the Environment Committee, approve the City of West St. Paul's comprehensive sewer plan and require the cities to submit to the council the final adopted ordinance that requires the disconnection of any identified prohibited discharges to the sanitary sewer system.
So a motion by Councilmember Lilligren on 2019-199 JT. Is there a second?
Second.
And a second by Councilmember Bento. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that is the report of the standing committees. We got through those pretty fast. And that brings us to our really big information item for tonight. So I invite Mary Bogie to come up. This is the 2020 preliminary budget and levies. So you all know that August 28th, we will be voting on the maximum levy we can spend. And then she's going to go over the schedule. On December 11th, we adopt the final budget levies. So as you all know, this is really important. Anytime you're dealing with money, it matters. And so we are going to take questions throughout. Is that correct? Okay. And we're anticipating, because it's 65 pages or something, or?
Madam Chair, yes, I apologize in advance that we have 65 slides to talk through our council budget with you. And I will say that this is the one time during the year that we get into the budget at this level of conversation. And we're asking you to adopt a $1 billion budget. And so I think it's appropriate that we spend that amount of time with you to help in your understanding and make it your budget.
Thank you. So we're anticipating at least an hour and a half at the minimum, and we don't know what the maximum will be, but we'll see how many questions there are. But it is important. If you have questions, ask them. So please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, council members. As we said, today we are here to present the council's preliminary 2020 operating budget and levies. And while there's been discussion at the committees about the division level budget, tonight is the council's first opportunity to hear about the proposed budget whole cloth. The preliminary budget is not the end of our budget development cycle. It's just a step along the way. We have two statutory deadlines highlighted in red on the budget development timeline. The budget that we are proposing today, and I will ask you to adopt on August 28th, establishes the upper limit for our property tax levy. After September 1, the council can lower, but it cannot increase the total levy amount. Metro area cities will consider our levy amount in establishing their own budgets and setting their own tax levies, and will mail the truth in taxation statements to property owners showing the proposed property taxes from all jurisdictions. As we move along in our budget development timeline through the public comment draft and to our final adoption in December, we may and typically do have adjustments to our operating budget, but we cannot adjust our budget to raise our levies. Our primary focus today is going to be on the operating budget, the operations, pass-through, and debt service, and on our property tax levy. In October, after discussion at the committee level, we'll come back to the council and highlight our capital program. That consists of our authorized projects, those for which we have funding secured, our 6-year plan, and then our 2020 spending plan for those authorized projects. Changes to our capital program happen through our amendment process. As projects move and get funded, they move from plan to authorize. As projects are completed, they are by amendment moved off of the capital program. We'll focus in that capital program presentation on pressures in the capital budget and on our policy decisions related to that capital program. Council members, we refer to our proposed operating budget, what's presented today, as the regional administrator's recommended budget as required by statute to be submitted to the council for approval. Ultimately, as we go through public comment and final adoption, it becomes the council's budget. So as we said at the beginning, I encourage you to ask questions as we go along today. And if you have other questions, I encourage you to follow up with myself or any of the other presenters here today. So I'm going to kick off the budget presentation today with a discussion of the council's property tax levies. The council has authority in statute to levy a property tax in the metro area for specific purposes to fund our grant and loan programs, for debt service obligations, and in a limited way for general purposes. Our non-debt service levies increase each year in accord with a measure of government inflation called the implicit price deflator. Over the past 10 years, the average increase has been about 2%, though we have seen years with less than 1% growth in the implicit price deflator. For 2020, the increase is 2.2%. Our debt service levies, on the other hand, are not limited by the inflation rate. But for transit and parks, they are effectively limited by our statutory authority granted for us to issue debt. Our wastewater debt is secured primarily through wastewater fees, but we have a secondary full faith and credit of the council, though we have never issued debt for our wastewater debt service. So our levy strategy has some levy givens. So we need to meet our debt service obligations for parks and transit. That's a given. Statutorily, we receive $5 million in fiscal disparities, and that goes to the tax-based revitalization account. Again, that's a given. And then we have some strategy-based decisions. Talking through with the regional administrator and the chair, we have held our total levy increase to a 2% annually increase for a number of years, and the regional administrator and the chair were comfortable with that 2% increase moving forward. Through our livable Though our livable communities and general purpose levies are limited by growth in statute, we have chosen to maximize those levies, and to create a TOD component within our livable communities demonstration account grant program. We're also providing funding to some small targeted initiatives within our general purpose levy. We have sufficient funding within our highway right-of-way program where we do not need to levy for that program. So we've got about $15 million in our reserve balances that are available should communities come seeking that funding. So this chart breaks out our 2020 proposed property tax levy. The total proposed levy, as I said, is a 2% increase, and it totals $88.7 million. So a few things to note on this slide. First, again, but for the highway right-of-way program, our non-debt service levies are at their statutory maximum. Any increase in our levy beyond the 2% would fall to debt service or to the highway right-of-way program, as we are at our max in the other levies. So general purposes is at its max, livable communities is at its max. Second, unlike other municipalities, the council's general purpose levy only funds about 2% of our operations. So, and again, if we increase our levy, it just falls to those other categories because we're at our max. Finally, you'll notice that we're not levying for our parks debt service. We have sufficient funds to meet our existing debt service because we did not issue debt in 2019 or 2018. And at this time, there is no anticipatory levy proposed for debt in 2020. Using the available gap then, under our 2% levy strategy, we have increased the transit debt service levy, and that will help ease pressure on this levy in future years. This map highlights our metro area and transit taxing area. So this is the 7-county metro area minus the cities of Hanover, Rockford, New Prague, and Northfield. The blue represents the transit taxing district as it was established by Minnesota statute, and the blue plus the red is our transit capital levy communities. That expanded in 2009 with the addition of Lakeville, in 2010 Forest Lake and Columbus, and in 2011 Mapleton. We do have some pressures on the sustainability of our 2% overall levy strategy. Primarily, that's coming from our regional transit bonding. We use our regional transit bonding primarily for fleet replacement. The federal government pays 80%, and we match with our state bonds 20% of that funding. That's a pretty good deal. We have had some success with the legislature in getting an inflation factor in our annual trips to the legislature to ask for our authority. And so that's about a 4.5% increase. So that increase, as you can see by the bottom of that chart, has our transit debt service levy taking up a larger portion of our overall levy. You can see it grew from 55 to 61 to 64% over the last 3 years. We've been able to maintain that 2% strategy because we have not had pressure on the levy from the highway right-of-way program or from the parks debt service. As those levies come back into play, we will have significant pressure then in probably not have that ability to maintain a 2% and will likely need to go to something higher than 2%. Our livable communities levies fund our administrative and community development and fund our grant programs. So the tax-based revitalization levy is dedicated to the cleanup of polluted land. The livable communities demonstration account, again, is proposed at its levy limit. We have a goal of growing that program to accommodate a TOD component of $5 million within that program and expect on the path that we're on that we will be able to meet that goal by 2023. The local housing incentives account receives statutory transfers both from the LCDA levy as well as $1 million from the general purpose levy, and is used to help municipalities fund their affordable and life cycle housing goals. And finally, we have our general purpose levy proposed at $15.7 million levy limit for 2020. General purpose levy is my favorite levy. And it's my favorite levy because we have broad and flexible funding use within the council's statutory responsibilities. But I'll remind you, it only funds 2% of our operations. We do have some primary funding responsibilities that we need to take care of out of the general purpose levy, including funding operations, primarily for community development, $11.3 million, and $1 million statutory transfer to the local housing incentive account. Historically, we had funded a portion of our regional administration expenses as well out of the general purpose levy. Within the last several years, we've chosen to allocate out all of the regional administration costs out to the operating divisions and free up some of the general purposes levies for targeted initiatives in each budget. So, hitting our commitment for community development and our statutory transfer to local housing, that leaves about $3.4 million for targeted initiatives. We've talked already in this meeting about needing to preserve housing vouchers in the HRA, and so $1 million of that has already been targeted for the HRA funding gap. And on this slide, we'll talk about the things that we have heard both from the chair and from the council members, that we are recommending the following initiatives also be funded out of that general purpose levy. So $700,000 for a Metro Mobility Premium Service Pilot. $200,000 is recommended for management workforce diversity, and that could be in the form of some training or some other services. $1 million is proposed commitment to regional homeless initiative. You've heard Meredith talk about this in previous meetings, and while everything isn't solidified around that yet, we are hoping to work with the Housing Finance Agency to make that funding available. And then another $500,000 is targeted at housing that is affordable, and that will likely be administered through our grant programs.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Deb Barber had to leave early, and so I'm asking a question on her behalf, but it also happens to be a question that I would like the answer to as well. In Community Development Committee, we've been talking about speaking with the communities that are covered by our Metro HRA about them covering the shortfall instead of us taxing the entire region for a program that only serves a portion of the region. And we were looking for an update on whether anything has happened as far as talking with those communities, because as I stated in community development, the other communities are already dealing with the same sort of shortfall. We're all under the same rules with the federal government. So if they're choosing to keep having their vouchers, they're paying for that shortfall with their own levies. And so it's kind of double dipping to make them pay for the communities that we're supposed to be administering this service for. So,
Ms. Bogey.
Madam Chair and committee members, I'm going to turn to Lisa Barajas and ask her to address that question.
Thank you, Councilmember. Madam Chair, council members, we did discuss this and we initiated a conversation, I know, with Chair Slawik and Councilmember Lilligren before I left on vacation. And I would actually defer to them on where that has gone. I just returned.
Cool. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ms. Barajas, and thanks, Councilmember Wupp, for bringing this up and for being consistent on this. And as we discussed in CD committee, we were waiting for that presentation that we had at the last meeting on this issue. I've engaged the chair. There's been discussion about having staff support, and now that Ms. Barajas is back, we can start moving on that. But the intent is to engage those communities, in this conversation. So that's where we're at now.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this has been going around for a while at the, I mean, it was discussed by the previous council, and then with changes in the election and the new administration and everything, nothing got done. Well, now it's August already. I mean, wow, I think the year's gone by really fast. But for a budget year, all of those communities are doing the same thing that we're doing right now in setting their budget. We're running out of time to have any potential solution there, and we can't keep doing this where all of the rest of the region is subsidizing the entities that don't want to administer their own program. So I would urge that we treat this with some urgency in the hopes of at least having some idea whether there's going to be a solution before we get to our final budget, rather than keep pushing this off year after year, because it's a significant portion of our general fund, and as was previously mentioned, we've got a lot of budget pressure on our levies right now. So finding out whether those communities care enough to pay for the shortfall in their vouchers is something that we need to do sooner rather than later and make some progress on this.
Councilmember Lundgren, any response? Are we able to do that soon then? Or I guess you're not probably sure, right?
So Ms. Brajas is nodding. As we had talked about this, I mean, Councilmember Wolf and Councilmember Barr are bringing this up in committee. And so the commitment was to have, to initiate these conversations before we approve our 2020 budget. So we'll move forward on that. And we'll see what the responses are. I would note that this $1 million dedicated to preserving housing vouchers is still appearing in the 2020 budget. We'll see what kind of progress we can make for 2020. And as we were just presented, we will need to raise our levy if we're going to continue to subsidize this. So I don't know that that's a satisfactory workout. So whether or not there's a 2020 solution in place by the time we approve our budget, I don't know. But we will have had conversations with the participating communities. And we do need, as Councilmember Brooke points out, we do need a sustainable workout.
Right. Really need a longer term solution on how to figure this out. So, okay. Thank you. Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So within these targeted initiatives, I think as a council, we haven't had a lot of opportunity to sit down and decide where we would choose to target initiatives or the dollars that are set aside for various initiatives. So I'm wondering, A, will we have that opportunity, and B, when that might be, and how much flexibility there is within the council to decide what our initiatives to move forward might be.
So, Madam Chair and committee members, as we established in the regional administrator's budget, these recommended uses for targeted initiatives, we were doing our best to listen to what we were hearing in your committee meetings and from you as we had individual meetings with you. So I'm hoping that what we have in front of you fit some of the conversations of what you would have been expecting to see in here, in particular as it relates to homelessness and housing that is affordable. I know we talked about the Metro Mobility pilot within the Transportation Committee, and of course we've talked about preserving housing vouchers in both the Community Development Committee as well as here in the council meetings. That indeed is a very complex problem that really is based on kind of the economics of rents rising and a funding source that relies on prior year expenditures. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, this is your first opportunity to hear the budget whole cloth. It's not your last opportunity, and so if there are things that we have as misses in this budget, I would expect that we have that conversation in between the time that we are adopting this preliminary budget and the time that we adopt our final budget, that we incorporate those things into the budget.
Councilmember
Thank you,
Cummings,
Madam Chair.
follow up?
And I appreciate, and clearly you've been listening to what's been said at a committee level and so forth. I think that
I'm hoping that maybe at a committee of the whole or something like that, we can have a whole council-wide discussion so that it reflects the values and interests of the entire council as much as possible, and not just the committees. I know that the work is done at the committee level, but it would be nice to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page on these things. They're big.
Okay, maybe you can talk further about that, or you can see if there's anything else on that. Anything else, or?
No, I'm good, thank
Okay.
you.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. To me, these things are really connected. One, I remember in our onboarding that this issue of community contribution was that Councilman Wolf, if I remember correctly, expressively talked about this along with a little bit of a directive or guidance on what would be the outcome if we didn't do it, at least from her perspective. So I just want to acknowledge that. Has it been 6 months for us? Is that right? It feels like a lifetime. I think it's been, so that was about 6 months ago. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And I think even at that time, if I recall correctly, we're talking about understanding the mechanics of having those conversations and integrating that into the cycle this time. So to me, I think this is one of those places where I just, I want to understand what's the realistic, is it realistic at this point to have these conversations and have that yield something for 2020? Or is that just not realistic at this point?
So, Madam Chair and committee members, I think that in the spring when we presented this issue with kind of some options, and we kind of showed what would happen if we reduced the housing vouchers, and it just is a cycle of eventually kind of killing off the program, right? Because if every year I'm based on last year's expenditures, I keep reducing each year the number of vouchers that I can fill. And we heard back that it was important for us to preserve these housing vouchers. At that time, we did talk about, okay, this is going to put pressure on our levy as well, and there needs to be a long-term solution as opposed to our short-term solution of funding this through the general purpose levy. I anticipated then, and it is true to what we are proposing, that we would not get that done within the 2020 budget cycle, and that we will need to fund this in 2020 through the general purposes levy, but that we would start to have those conversations during 2019 here, so that as we get to our next budget cycle, because they are preparing their budgets at the same time we're preparing our budgets, they're not prepared for us to have that discussion with them and to build it into their 2020 budget. We're more likely to be able to do something in that 2021 budget. This does take some time, in particular when you're transitioning a new council and you're all learning about not just this issue or challenge in our budget, but other challenges as it relates to transportation funding. It does take time for these things to really get down to what is the policy decision that we're making, who's going to carry that policy decision, who do we need to connect to, and I do think that staff can help to coordinate those discussions, but some of that discussion has to happen at that policymaker level.
Just
Follow up.
a follow up. I really the other part of this, I think also is I appreciate the intent around listening and bringing something for us to react to, but I would really, and I'll speak for myself, like a much more explicit conversation around this. I would like to throw out there that at, whether it's a committee of the whole or at our retreat, that this is part of what we talk, or one of our retreat opportunities coming up, that this is what we talk about. For me, we all have talked a lot about equity and how it shows up in our work, and these things, with the exception of potentially management workforce diversity, don't really get at systematic equity issues. And we've identified and had lots of conversations about a number of ideas and opportunities and needs and things like that. So just um, that's something that I think that I'd like to see reflected as a key value in here. Um,
So I'm hearing from two council members that they're interested in that. Does that sound, is there any other feedback on that? Do you see some head nodding? So,
Madam Chair and committee members, I would definitely encourage you to have that conversation, but I will also say just because it doesn't appear on the targeted list for general purpose levy does not mean that those things are not built into our overall budget. And a lot of those equity things that we've funded before in targeted initiatives, we did a grant program that was specifically targeted to equity grants within the council. A lot of those things are built into our operating budgets and not into this very small piece of the general purpose levy. And so as we go through our presentation today, hopefully we can pull some of those stories out for you. But don't, the point that I want to get across is if just because it's not appearing on our small list of targeted initiatives doesn't mean that it's not in our budget.
Councilmember Sterner.
Yeah, I just thought when we're looking at this, we also, I think we want to look at the fiscal disparities program as well and what the formula is for that. So if we're looking at different things, we can kind of look at kind of everything at once on that to get educated on it.
Councilmember Wolf.
Okay. Madam Chair, I just trying to clarify what Councilmember Sterner said. Is the fiscal disparities is put together by the legislature, and we have no opportunity to make any changes for it. So what is it that you're looking
Well,
for?
we do have a government relations person that can go to legislature and change that if it's not reflecting our values of the Metropolitan Council. So that's what we're looking at, that it's something that we want to reflect that, what we're doing, and direct our government relations person on that if we want to make changes.
That would probably be, so we're doing on our legislative initiatives. That would probably be the better
Yeah,
place for
correct,
that.
yeah.
And we're doing that right now too. Is that already closed up or?
Madam Chair, council members, that is nearly closed. The due date to the governor's office is the end of this week. And so I believe you all got a couple emails asking for those by August 1st. Judd's been working through those and we'll submit those. And then, of course, as a part of the administration, our legislative initiative is what the governor's office approves.
Right. So one thing is maybe email Judd and he can add that into the mix, but I think it's, we're really limited as the administration, I think is what we're hearing, but there is a list. And that's, I think, council members, part of what I'm trying to do is create sort of lists, right, of things we are thinking about, things we want to do, and to try to track, where we're at with things, right? Because things keep sort of go up and then they slip off and those types of things. And this is obviously a very big place. Any advice, regional administrator, on the comments and, the amount of workshops that are left and how we can maybe address this? And
Madam Chair, council members, I would encourage you, if you have specific ideas right now, to email those to Mary or to myself or to some of our division directors so we can really look at what that is, what it might cost. We could bring some definition back to you. We are tight on the calendar going through about October between folks gone for Railvolution and need for mini retreats, I guess we're calling them. It's eating up a lot of our committee the whole time, or potentially eating it up. I don't think any of that's locked in. And so we'll take a look tomorrow. Liz and I can go through that calendar and try to find a slot to have a conversation. But the more we can do up front and the more sort of you can send us by email and we can say, yep, it's either already in the transit budget or let's flesh that out. What does it look like? How much does it cost? The more we can sort of expedite that conversation.
Councilmember Atlas Ingridson.
Thank you, Chair. Would it be possible to get like a scan of our equity efforts, like organizationally? Like, are we tracking those? I know that, like, do we have a way where we're able to identify where we're working to address inequities or systematic issues and kind of track all those efforts across the agency.
Regional Administrator.
Madam Chair, Council Member, I see Cy in the audience here, so I'm going to defer to Cy Jordan on the bulk of that answer. I will say that we have tracked what we call the equity commitments that were in Thrive, and we have tracked some very explicit work, but there is other work that maybe isn't as explicit, that may not be as well tracked. And I think Cy and Mitzi and her staff have been working through some additional tracking that I'll leave her to speak to.
Welcome to the council.
Thank you, Chair, Council Members. I opportunity to excuse my voice today. And so, yes, we do have a list. It is this extensive about council for this decade. It does need some updates, so certainly working on that for be able to provide that to you.
Chair, could will we be able to get that in the time frame we need? Like, or like, is it the next couple of weeks? Is it a month? Or
Madam Chair, Council Member, this council will adopt the preliminary budget in 2 weeks, but again, that's our preliminary budget. Really, between now and December, when we adopt the final budget, is all space for us to have conversation about what our budget looks like. And so I'll defer to Cy on timing, but certainly we have some time.
Ms. Jordan.
And so timing for us is probably in the next 30 days together the current projects that we're working on.
great.
So the one thing just to say is we're new, right? We're all new. I was new in the council, right? And new at the legislature at some point. And so we're learning, right? And so one thing I would encourage is you to meet and talk through it because it's hard just to get a budget, right? With line items. And so if we can talk about that or bring it to a meeting and talk about it, but I don't know how extensive, maybe I guess I would love to have a copy of that too. And so just have some context, right? And so then is what I see happen with groups, right, is then you think about where can we go, right? So it's that, and then where can we go, and then where are you going, and all those kinds of things. So I think it's, as you know, it is a priority for the council, and we just have to figure out, not only this year, for the next 4 years that we're all here, how to think about those kinds of increases and where they should be, and I think that's obviously a really good discussion, and then hopefully we can figure out how to fit things into this year. So that's the complications. And I am not surprised to hear people wondering things like this because this is what happens, right? Because we don't have those baselines as clearly as you all do. And so we're trying to learn where things are at and then learn how the money's being spent. And then if there's any wiggle room, I suppose, and how that's decided. But it sounds like the general purpose target this is really the area.
Madam Chair and committee or council members, I'm going to back up to our property tax levy slide.
Okay.
And
Thank
again,
you.
note that how we spend within the levies is certainly something that we can change between now and when we adopt the final budget. The levy amount that we are adopting is maxed out for general purposes for livable communities. We get $5 million from the fiscal disparities, and the rest is debt service. And so, when I ask you next week to adopt the maximum levy, adopting the maximum levy does not impact what ultimately you decide you want to target with the funding in the general purpose levy that's available. So I've got $3.4 million available within that general purpose levy, and how you decide to spend that can certainly change from the targeted initiatives that we have here to something different.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just was referring back to this email because we ran out of time at the retreat, which was wonderful, was valuable use of time. And so we're looking now at the Committee of the Whole in October 2nd and 16th from 4 to 6. According to this recent email, they're completely open, and we're looking at follow-ups for equity and goals on strategic planning. And so if we can kind of commit to that, I think that would be useful for all of us, and hopefully kind of keep those 2 sessions not get lots of add-ins, that we run out of time, or we only wind up with 45 minutes or something like that. But I think this would be really very helpful for me, as I've gotten up to speed on everything, and hopefully I'm learning as well, but for us to kind of put all our heads together and talk about these things that we kind of didn't have a chance to do at the retreat. That would be my hope.
So council members, so what I'm trying to look for, if there's interest from a couple of people, right? I think we have two at least, and so you see some heads, and so yes. So we'll have to talk about how that works, because that time is for equity, and so going over the budget is maybe part of that time, during that time. Okay. Makes sense? Ms. Bogie, any comments? Since you've been putting this together,
Again, Madam Chair, this is your first look, I'll call it, at the budget. It's not your last look. We are at the first step rather than the last step. And so we have time between when we adopt our preliminary budget on the 28th and set the maximum levy. We certainly have time between then and the public comment draft in October, and finally the adopted budget in December, to make tweaks to the budget that don't impact the levy. And since the levy is at the max for all of our non-debt service levies, and our general purpose levy only funds 2% of our operations, I don't think there will be changes in our operating budget that have any risk of impacting our levy.
okay, thank you. You want to proceed?
All right, this next slide is my typical 250,000 home. It's in our metro area, and kind of when I put out my all things being equal year over year caveat, that if a homeowner resides within the transit taxing communities, our 2% levy increase would bring their total amount that they pay for the council services for transit for our region to $52.97. That's about a 2.3% increase for those inside the transit taxing communities. And for those outside the transit taxing communities, again, those don't get the debt service levy for transit, they would pay $16.22, and that's about a 2.5% decrease. That decrease is very much related to the parks debt service levy not being there in 2020. And as you know, things are not equal year over year, and individual taxpayers may have different experiences as it relates to the values of their properties. So I won't say for sure this is exactly what a $250,000 homeowner might have, but it gives us kind of a feeling of where we might lie. Depending on policy decisions that we make around parks capital program, our levy in the future might see that shift back of increase, decrease between inside and outside of the transit taxing area. I always like to show this slide, as it shows that we've been pretty good stewards of our levy. And when we put into context the council's levy over the metro taxing jurisdictions, you'll see that the council has actually been a declining share of the metro tax dollar. We were at about 2% just maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and we're down to about 1.4%. And again, this is not an apples to apples comparison, as counties, cities, and schools use their levy and their general purposes portion of their levy at a higher, they have more flexibility, I should say, than the council has, and our levy is primarily for debt service and our grant programs, and a very small amount for funding our operations. So with that, we will start to take a look at our overall budget, and then we'll follow up with a drill down into each of the divisions' budgets. The 2020 operating budget is a $1.2 billion budget, and it represents about a 4.1% increase over the 2019 budget. The chart on the left side of this slide here shows a breakout between operations, pass-through, debt service, and other post-employment benefits, similarly to the prior year. The OPEB, or other post-employment benefits, reflects our fully funded status for our retiree health care liability, and the earnings in our OPEB fund balance pay our retiree health care premiums. As with last year, the earnings in OPEB are projected to exceed our budgeted needs in 2019, and then as a result, we'll be adding to the reserves for the OPEB fund by a small amount, and this growth is anticipated as we need this fund to fund our future liabilities for all of our retirees and our existing employees who have this benefit into the future throughout their lives. I will say that our retiree healthcare has been sunset for all of our bargaining units, but we have current employees who were hired before those sunset dates that if they meet their service years and retirement age requirements within the plan, are eligible to receive this benefit. Our pass-through funding is relatively stable year over year, and changes primarily reflect just the timing of drawing down funds by our grantees as they complete their projects. We've already talked a little bit about debt service and the pressures as it relates to property tax. Lisa Thompson will speak in more detail about debt service and the pressure that it's putting on the environmental services budget as she gets up to present. On the right side of this chart here is a breakout just of that dark blue area, the operations portion of our operating budget. And so we're bursting that out year over year, and that's about a 4% increase year over year. Breakout categories there, salaries and benefits represent about 60% of our operating budget, and the year over year change there primarily reflects the wage and benefit increases of our marketing contracts and our healthcare benefits. Most of the increase that we're seeing in the contracted services, the green area of the bars there, are related to our transit provider contracts, and you'll hear a little bit more about that when we talk about transportation, or they're technology related, and you'll hear more about that as I talk about regional administration. So these pie charts show our operating budget and sources and uses. The left side shows a breakout by division. Note on this slide that light blue area is regional administration and other post-employment benefits. Only a small portion of the regional administration budget shows up here. The rest of it is allocated out to each of the operating divisions and shows up within their operating budgets. Important note on the right side pie chart is that these funding sources that we see in this pie chart look the same year after year. The funding sources are the same and the proportional shares are very much the same. So our funding sources for the programs that we operate here at the council are very much the same year after year. Charges for services, the dark blue in the pie chart, both for wastewater and fares, represent about a third of our operating funding. State appropriations and motor vehicle sales tax, the green, or state revenues, are a little over a third of our funding. The federal government, the red slice there, contributes about $107 million to our operating budget, and that's primarily our pass-through to our HRA program, to landlords for operating that program, and also federal revenues in our budget for preventative maintenance in our transportation program. Our property tax levy in purple there on the pie chart represents about 8% of our operating budget, but as you saw on previous slides, they're primarily the debt service and the pass-through grant programs. Only 2% of that levy actually funds our operations, and that's a portion of the general purpose levy that we just spent a little bit of time talking about. Other is primarily investment income in our OPEB plan. We have a planned use of reserves for operations that's primarily in transportation, and we'll talk more about that as we get to the transportation presentation. So I've given you an overall picture of our proposed budget, and now we plan to shift gears and talk more into a division level, and I'm going to start out by talking about the general fund as a whole. So at the council, we use our general fund to account for the activities of regional administration and community development. The sources of funding shown here in the middle of this slide are primarily our regional administration cost allocation to our operating divisions and our general purpose property tax levy. And again, that funds primarily community development and those targeted initiatives that we have highlighted in green there. On the expense side of the slide there, the pie chart there, it shows that salaries and benefits represent about 60% of our overall operating budget. The orange there that you see as transfers, $1 million of that is our statutory transfer to the local housing incentive account. For each of our operating funds, the council has established reserve targets. For the general fund, that reserve target is 10% of operating expense before the one-time initiatives, targeted initiatives. We established target reserves to help us manage cash flow within a fund, as well as to address unforeseen conditions. The rating agencies love that we have a targeted reserve balance for each of our operating funds. The reserve target for 2020 is $7.9 million, and our projected year-end reserve is just over $10 million. I'm comfortable in the general fund with being a little bit above target. Again, this is our most flexible funding. It's a small dollar amount, and we've used it in the past as a bridge to solve problems and find other funding sources. Therefore, I'm not recommending this budget that we spend down the general fund, but if in your conversations there's something really important to the council members above and beyond the $3.4 million that we have in targeted initiatives, this is the place that I would look to fund that. It's important to note that because when we allocate our regional administration costs, we set a budget, but we only charge actuals, that the only way I grow the reserve is if community development comes in under budget. So it's a slow growing reserve. It's a small amount, but there's a little bit of room there should the council have some really pressing needs that it wants to address.
Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure I missed this, but on slide 18, the uses by category, the other at 11 million, can you say more about that 11 million?
Mr. Chair and council members, so the breakouts that I have on here are salaries and benefits and contracted services. Other are all the other things related to utilities, rent, travel, printing, everything else you can think of that's not salaries and benefits and contracted services.
Thank you.
So in the last couple slides for me, I'm going to talk about the regional administration budget, $71.2 million. This is about a 7% increase, primarily due to increases in our information services. Our hardware and software costs increase at a rate that's much higher than an inflationary rate. Normally we look at inflation at about a 3 to 3.15% increase. We see increases in our hardware software maintenance more in the 5 to 6% increases. So that's a big factor in the change there. We've also had some transfers of some positions between Metro Transit and regional administration. That is not an increase to the overall budget. It is just a difference in how that is charged, whether it's charged through the allocation or whether it's in their budget. We've also put more emphasis in this budget on our MCUB expansion and reporting, and we're actually seeing the benefits of this. Councilmember Ferguson talked about earlier. We've actually targeted some of that already in this budget and carry it forward then into the 2020 budget, and that's a couple of additional positions in our procurement function that we're really targeting on working with size team and OEO and getting our engagement out there both within the council and outside of the council to those MCUB vendors. Regional administration, we really subdivide into functional categories here. As you can see, information services is the large part of our budget, and again, that's driven both by people as well as by the council-wide systems and hardware. That comes down to our fare collection systems, our administrative systems for HR and finances, the signage, all of those things run through our information services budget. business services are really our communications, community relations, kind of the management of our records retention, those kinds of things. Financial services, that's myself and our budget and payroll and risk management teams. And then administrative services are the chair's budget, those pieces of council. If you look at the right side of that chart, you can see that we're very heavily in regional administration. Over 60% of our budget is salaries and benefits. And we're also very heavily in contracted services, and that directly ties to those information services, hardware, software licenses. Far on the right there, you see the sources of revenue. Again, we allocate the costs of regional administration out to the divisions. We're using a very small portion of the general purpose levy. From other revenues, that's investment income and some work that we do for the airports that they pay us for the MAC, and then a very small use of reserves. This is our regional administration cost allocation. We allocate of that 71 million, we allocate 70 million out to the divisions, and this is the divisional share of those costs. Depending on the service area, the basis for allocation changes. So for instance, when we allocate our human resources department, we use FTEs. When we allocate finance, we use transaction costs. So we try to tie the basis for those allocations to the type of service that we're delivering to each of the divisions. And this is really very much a shared service. It doesn't make sense for us to have an HR department in each of those divisions. It's much more cost effective for us to have that centralized and then allocate those costs out to the divisions. So with that, Madam Chair, I would like to move on to our next division, which is the Community Development Division. Thank you.
Thank you for her presentation. Mary's always good about if you have questions, you can call her or email her directly as well. So come on up. Welcome to the council.
Good afternoon, council members, Madam Chair. I'm Lisa Barajas, the Community Development Director.
And I'm Heather Augustin-Hebner, the Finance Director for Community Development.
So you'll hear me repeat some of the things that Mary said in her presentation because, of course, we're general fund supported, but I want to focus on a couple of other things that we have going on in CD. As you know, CD budget is built from a base that includes meeting both federal and state requirements and implementing past council actions, including negotiated labor contracts, housing voucher rent limits, and pass-through programs. The CD budget is heavily influenced by those decisions from the past council, and your policy decisions will carry forward to future councils as well. Our preliminary 2020 operating and pass-through program is nearly $116 million. The HRA budget is projected to increase 2.4%, and our program budget, consisting of our program units, is projected to stay level with the exception of these targeted initiatives. I'll walk through each of these initiatives in more detail on some future slides here. Mary has already talked about the homelessness initiative and affordable housing, which we'll get some more meat on the bones on, especially after conversations with council members in your future workshops and conversations that we have with Minnesota Housing going forward. I want to give all of you, I know our CD members have seen some of these slides, but just some basis, what our HRA program, who we serve and what it means. Our program supports 19,000 people a month, including 9,500 children. The average family size is 2.9 persons, and the average household income is about $18,000 a year. That's it. 46% of our households have wage income, and 47% of our households are elderly and disabled. Essentially, those who can work, do work. Average tenant rent share is about $420 a month, and the average HRA rent share is $765. As we've mentioned previously and in our Community Development Committee, that rent share is putting some significant pressures on our overall HRA budget because our federal dollars haven't been keeping up with those increases. As you've heard, we have some challenging timing issues as well because the council's budget development schedule does not align cleanly with the federal government's and their schedule. They release data that we need to make some critical policy decisions, and we don't have that data yet. That includes federal funding levels, the federal fair market rent analysis, and what our moving to work status might be. All three of these variables have the potential to have a material impact on our 2020 budget. So we will be back in front of you later this fall to discuss those rent standards and the utility allowance policies and how these policy decisions impact families in the region, community choice, program size, and the potential general purpose levy investment. Council action on these items will inform our final budget and the number of vouchers that we will be able to issue. Our current budget is built on the assumptions that past federal funding levels will hold and that rent increases will be back to historic averages of 2% annual growth. Both of these items are known risks and are out of our direct control, but we think looking at the scope of all of the data that we have in front of us that these are the most appropriate measures to take. As some of you are aware, in the last couple of years, we've experienced much higher rent increases year over year, 5 to 7% essentially, which are well above historic averages. Our research department has reason to believe that these are starting to level off, and we hope that that's the case, and so those are the numbers that we are using at this point. So to some of our initiatives for this year, I'm going to start with our Regional Parks Visitor Study. This visitor study provides key inputs to funding allocation formulas that are set out in legislation. Yes.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question on the cost for the HRA program. And at the management meeting, we were discussing about the fairly likelihood of a recession coming up. And some of the projections of how that will impact our budgeting. So I'm just wondering if we can think back at the 2006, 2007 historical experience. When there is a recession, I will imagine that there will be increased need for vouchers, but that will also drive down the cost, the market value of rent. Is that accurate, or how will that play out? We're going to have more need, but will be a wash, or will be, how that goes?
Madam Chair, Council Member Gonzalez, certainly there is increased need, and as you may recall, when we opened our waiting list earlier this year, we had thousands and thousands of applications well beyond what we could actually support with our voucher program, and that's in a hot market. I'm not recalling the charts off the top of my head, but Heather may recall looking at historical data what our rents look like in the past downturn.
So Madam Chair, council members, I don't have the specific numbers. We can certainly take a look at it. I can tell you that historically, the rent limits have a really big impact on our budget. So as the rent limits go down over time, let's say the rent costs start to go down, that means we're going to be able to fully issue all of our vouchers within our federal formula earnings. As the rents go up, we can't. So I would say broadly, if the housing market goes down, if the rents go down, or at least stay level, that's good for us from a pure budgeting standpoint. As far as how many vouchers we can issue, we have a cap right now on what we can issue, and every once in a while there are opportunities and choices we make about whether or not we apply for more vouchers. What I can do is we will be coming back to the Community Development Committee this fall with some information items once we know more from the federal government, and we can incorporate some of this historical information in that time.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Please proceed.
So on the regional parks study, the visitor study, without this study, we would have no way to distribute funds to the agencies as is required by Minnesota state statutes. Our goal is to perform the study every 5 years, starting in 2020. The study is also our opportunity to collect data on the demographics of park visitors and the activities that they pursue. This allows us to identify inequities or differences in use across demographic groups and helps inform investments to create a more equitable system. The planned survey improves on past studies. First, it better addresses undercoverage of limited English proficiency visitors, fast-moving trail users, and youth under 18. It also allows for complete collection of demographic data, including additional disaggregation of race, ethnicity, and gender identity. The visitor study will also provide some key data to independently assess our use of cell phone GPS data, which we use to study visitation to individual parks and trails. If we verify our approach, we can provide demographic and other key visitation data for individual parks and trails, a level of representativeness that would be extremely cost prohibitive to achieve with just a survey alone. Park level data will vastly improve our ability to inform decisions on equity or other planning investments. For example, understanding which parks and trails have the greatest inequity in usage will help us identify where investments will be most effective and help the council and our parks implementing agencies better target outreach and awareness building efforts. Our next initiative is in the Local Planning Assistance Department, which leads the council's implementation of the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. One way it does this is providing technical assistance to communities on topics around land use, parks, transportation, economic competitiveness, climate resilience, equity, and engagement through the Planet Initiative. Local Planning Assistance initially started the Planet program in 2016 and 17 to help communities help support communities in developing their comprehensive plans, and brought workshops, coordinated training series, speakers, online tutorials, and a variety of other resources to communities to help them in the development of their plans. As we work through the review and authorization of those comprehensive plans, of which we had 5 of those tonight and have a whole slew upcoming, then communities will be turning to actually implementing those plans. And there are a number of other resources that we've heard from communities, a desire to have to help them in that implementation around other issues as well. This may include additional workshops, tutorials, webinars, etc. But local planning staff will be engaging with the stakeholders to finalize what those details will be, what sorts of topics are of interest to local governments, whether it's anything from updating local ordinance and zoning code to how do we actually put climate resilience into our capital plan. Those are the types of things that we'll be engaging with local government staff and policymakers on what resources would be of most interest of them to help build that program and deliver that to them in this coming year and forward. And our final initiative, I believe, yes, is the Climate Stats Initiative that I have heard some about earlier this year. The Greenhouse Gas Initiative that Mauricio Leon and my research department had presented to you, starting with our transportation portion of that. Thrive, this is a project that's identified directly in Thrive, and it states that planning for sustainability means providing leadership, information, and technical assistance to support local government's consideration of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And many local governments in this region have wanted to act on climate change by reducing their greenhouse gas initiatives, following the goals that are set in state statute as well. The Council is uniquely positioned to provide that regional data set and carbon reduction strategies given our understanding of transportation and land use in the region. Metro Climate Stats will provide high-quality data and research to help inform planning around the region. The study's unique and innovative approach to providing technical assistance on climate change mitigation for communities by a regional planning agency. The initiative will provide a cost-benefit informed portfolio of strategies to reduce carbon in the transportation and land use sectors. It will also remove technical obstacles for climate action planning for communities. We know this is a significant undertaking. Our staff have the capacity to gather lots of data and to do this work, that we know that outside of maybe our biggest cities in the region, most of our other communities in the region don't have that staff capacity in their day-to-day to do, and can be very cost ineffective for them to hire on their own. At a regional scale, we can both provide that research, but also use that same data to help inform our own operational decisions around transportation and land use. So I'll turn it over to Heather, unless there are any questions on the program. She will be speaking specifically to the numbers.
Okay, so everybody ready for your pie charts? So first I'm going to walk you through the community development operating budget, and then I'll walk you through our pass-through portion of the program. Our proposed 2020 operating budget is $22 million. About $10.2 million funds unit operations in the division. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. 8.6 million funds HRA options to deliver rent assistance and provide affordable housing for low-income individuals in the region. And about $3.5 million is programmed for housing-related initiatives. So if you look at the slide under uses, nearly half of our funding is for staff. Our staff coordinate planning and policy to guide the growth and development of the region and the regional park system. We provide technical assistance to local government to implement regional policy in their comprehensive plans. We facilitate community collaboration, and we identify, analyze, and report on issues of regional importance. So the remaining half of our budget pays for regional allocations for centralized services that Mary talked about earlier. It pays for the targeted initiatives that we talked about earlier. We pay for debt service to pay off our regional parks debt. And the remaining budget funds contracted services, consulting, and other smaller ticket items such as printing and small office equipment. This is the area of our budget where we are closely looking for opportunities to support the MCUB program. We've met with procurement and EEO staff and continue to look for opportunity to support MCUB businesses. So the general levy purpose pays for nearly 65% of our expenses. I'm not going to go in great detail about that because Mary just talked about it. Our federal revenue is used for HRA administration. We don't know yet what our federal funding levels are, but we have assumed that we basically looked at what has history told us about what we're expected to get from the federal government, and that's what we built in as our assumption. Our other category primarily represents council-owned housing rental payments. So we're essentially a landlord. So as we get rental payments, we earn money on that, and that money is put back into the program. And I think that is about what I'll cover here, unless anybody has detailed questions. Okay, so if you take our operating and pass-through budget together, nearly 83% of our budget is passed through in the form of housing payments, grants to park implementing agencies, and livable community grants. The council has varying levels of control over these programs. For example, the park's operating and maintenance pass-through program is directed by state statute. The HRA is highly regulated by the federal government, but the council does have influence over rent limits. And the council has a good deal of influence over the Livable Communities Pass-Through program through its levy strategies and approval of the annual fund distribution plan. As a quick reminder, the fund distribution plan establishes the annual plan for distributing funds under the State Livable Communities Act. And with that, we'd be happy to stand for any questions. Otherwise, we will transition over to environmental services.
Any questions? Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just interested to know where there was the most robust discussion around portions of the budget that are, say, fully funded versus things you might have wanted to fund more, but there just wasn't the resources.
Ms. Barajas.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Fredson, we actually have had some transitions over the last couple of years that have freed up some budget that we had not expected, and we had some cost savings in some other areas. We have some programs year to year. So long story short, community development's work is on a 10-year cycle. We know what we're going to do year to year. These are the things we have to do. We know what we're expecting to do. In 2019, we're going to be reviewing comp plans. In 2020, we're going to re-enroll LCA program, et cetera. So there's lots of different things that we know are going to happen, and those things are in program, like the Parks Visitor Study. So those program things take those priorities. And as we look through all of the work that we had, we're feeling very comfortable with the existing budget allocation that we could do all the things that we were wanting to do with the staff that we had. Outside of the HRA, and that's probably where we have the most robust discussion is how do we figure out how to close this gap? What other strategies do we have? Looking under every cushion for any extra change. Is there any other place? But in the remainder of the CD budget, the initiatives that we have, as Heather had talked about, are primarily funded by staff and our staff doing the work, and having the staff that we have is how we get our work done.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Next, we have environmental services.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Lisa Thompson, General Manager of Environmental Services, and I'm going to introduce the Environmental Services budget, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ned Smith, our Director of Finance and Revenue, to go through the numbers. I found he's a lot better at making finance fun than I am, so this time of the day, it's probably a good thing to have a little fun. The budget we are presenting you today supports meeting the environmental services purpose, which is to protect human health, protect the environment, and support the economic growth of our region. We carry this out through our planning roles in wastewater, water supply, and water resources, and by operating the regional wastewater system. That regional wastewater system consists of $7 billion in infrastructure, and that provides us the capacity to serve approximately half of the population of the state of Minnesota. We provide treatment services to 110 communities and 800 industries, who we consider to be both customers and partners. We could not provide those services so efficiently and effectively without the partnership part of that. We respect and appreciate our customers, and we would like that to be mutual. So we use established customer levels of service to ensure that our performance earns their respect and appreciation. The budget we have developed will provide the resources to continue meeting and improving our customer levels of service. We have 3 categories of service levels, and I'll briefly give you an indication of how well we are doing in each of those, beginning with our most important, health, safety, and environment. Compliance with our facility permits is the gold standard for gauging performance in this category. Year over year, we meet those requirements without interruption, and that places us among the best in the country. Our 2 highest consecutive year facilities, each of these bars represents how many years in a row a plant has had perfect compliance. So looking at our top 2, 27 years with St. Croix Valley and 28 with Hastings, there's only 2 plants in the country with better records. One is at 29 years and one is at 30 years. And this year we reached a milestone. If you add all those years together, we have 99 years of combined platinum compliance years. In our customer service category, we've made the greatest strides in the past several years. The pictures you see here were taken at a customer budget forum, which we have changed in many ways in recent years to become a better opportunity to engage with our customers and provide a communication platform that allows them to get individual attention, as well as hearing the big picture as an entire group for great transparency. In the financial category, our charges and fees is a top priority, and the perspective of our customers on whether we provide our services at a fair price is a critical indicator of how well we are doing. We've had anecdotal feedback through the years from our communities in this regard, such as the one that I fondly remember receiving from a public works manager who said, "The best check I write every month is to you guys. We don't have any of those headaches that go along with it. It's a really good deal." Now, as good as it feels to receive that kind of feedback directly, we decided we needed a more measured approach. So we conducted a formal customer survey process in 2018. And today I'm sharing with you the survey results on satisfaction with our services and fairness on our pricing. We surveyed 3 customer populations, the 110 communities, and the 800 industries that hold permits with us to discharge directly to our system, and a water resources group that consists of watersheds and watershed management organizations. When they were asked to rate their overall satisfaction with our services, we received the percentages shown for satisfied or very satisfied. And while we'd like to see even higher satisfaction scores, we're also really happy to report that of the percentage of those who were very dissatisfied, we got zeros. And of special interest to you as we consider our budget proposal today is what the communities think about our pricing for our services. 69% agree or strongly agree that our services are fairly priced. 0% were very dissatisfied, and 4% we're dissatisfied. We'd like to have no dissatisfieds, but I think on human nature, when somebody asks you, how's the price, you always would like a better deal, right? So I don't know if we really can ever achieve that, but it's still a good goal. And now I'll turn it over to Ned to present the budget details.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, members of the committee. My name is Ned Smith. I'm the Director of Finance and Revenue for MCES. So one of the hallmarks of our financial approach is what we've called the 4% promise. So even though, and that's what we're trying to do to get that 69% even higher approval. So we have committed to our customers that the aggregate municipal wastewater charge increase will not be more than 4% annually through 2022. This was a promise we made in 2017, and we've been doing this. This will be our third year of that promise, 2018, 2019, 2020. I'll walk through later exactly what those look like. This has been a special challenge for us because we do have the debt bubble that Mary alluded to earlier. Between 2018 and 2023, our debt service will be increasing by $8 to $10 million per year. So if it was $135 million in one year, that means it's $145 million in the next year. And a 4% promise means that we can only increase our rates by about $8 to $10 million per year. So our entire increase in our rates is going to be consumed by our debt service. But we still think this is an important benchmark for our customers. Most of these are obviously cities where they deal with 1%, 2%, and 3% increases. So it's hard for us to come out with 5% increases when they are constrained. So the way we've been doing that is working on optimizing our budget through facility teams to do integrated long-term planning and scheduling office to work to schedule to the work instead of scheduling to shifts. Our energy savings efforts, some as simple as, well, not simple, but as basic as LED upgrades, but also the fourth incinerator and the additional energy generation that will happen through that, in addition to our solar efforts and other energy saving processes around our plants and through our capital program. And finally, technology as we look for ways to automate and run our plants more efficiently. This is also part of how we work to improve our customer understanding. So we help them understand the issues we're facing and the issues that we are taking, the steps that we're taking, and that's primarily through our budget forums. And then finally, in our workshops. And finally, our CIP program structure. We've been looking out 3, 5, and 10 years to look for opportunities to smooth out some of the peaks in our debt service, in our capital, in our bonding and our borrowing from the PFA, because changes there can make an impact on our annual expenses. So jumping into the actual numbers, again, we're in year 3 of our 5-year promise. We're at a 3.6% increase in municipal wastewater charges. I do want to emphasize that none of your communities will see a 3.6% increase. That's because there are three factors that drive your MWC. The first is what we do with the total budget, but the second is what your community's flow is, and the third is what the overall regional flow is. So we use an allocation method. So for 2020, we used 2018 flows. So we figure out a 3.6% increase means we need to collect $235 million. We look at 2018 and we say, okay, this city A, was 10% of the total regional flow. And so therefore they need to pay $23.5 million, which we allocate 10% to them. Cities generally like this, and we generally like it. Our bonding agencies like it because we get consistent revenue, and the cities like it because they know up to 9 months in advance what their bill is going to be for the following year. So it basically eliminates volatility from the revenue collection and revenue charging for our customers. And then also we're able to give that information to them in May, and they like having that early certainty so they can start to build their 2020 budgets. So that is $235.6 million. Again, that's an $8.6 million increase over 2019, which is very similar to what our debt service went up. That translates to about $5 annually per household. So in the wastewater service fees that they'll receive from us go up $5 per year. Sewer availability charge has no change, and that is at $2,485 per SAC unit. That's been flat since 2014. The transfer for FY20 Fiscal year 20 is going to be 48.2 million. And what a transfer means is we collect SAC and we put it in a reserve fund. And then at the end of the year, we use that fund to pay the SAC portion of our debt service. So SAC only pays for debt, about 30% of it. But we did add another $2 million to pay for PAYGO. Our SAC reserve is in a very comfortable position right now. And growth continues to be robust. The management committee heard this afternoon that our SAC year to date is 25% higher than last year at this time. So we are predicting another healthy year for SAC. And so we want to use some of that reserve to help pay for PAYGO. PAYGO is pay as you go, which is using operating funds to pay for capital projects. But we see this as also a way that SAC can basically prepay the borrowing that we're going to do. So rather than go out and borrow $2 million, SAC will just pay $2 million up front. And then we do take steps to track that for the next 20 years to make sure that SAC gets credit for the fact that it basically prepaid the debt. In terms of our industrial waste strength charge, we charge additional fees to our strength industrial customers for the additional strength that they are sending to us. That's going to go up 4.5%. And then our industrial waste permit fees are going to go up 3.6%. What does this mean for an annual sewer charge per household? Very proud to point out that consistently we are still, again, about 40% of the national average for our peer agencies. You can see the blue bar there is the NACWA, NACWA being National Association of Clean Water Agencies. They do a survey every 2 years, and you can see we're 40% less than that. The yellow line is CPI, the Consumer Price Index for the Twin Cities, so you can see how that's varying. But we never pass up a chance to remind everyone that we are 40% less than the national average. So in terms of how the 5-year municipal wastewater charge promise has been, again, 2018, we had a 3.7%, 2019, 3.5%, 2020 was 3.6%. We'll be keeping that at 4% or less for the next 2 years. And then in the future, we'll be looking to stay at or below the inflation rate. So time for pie, not the good kind. Total operations are $162 million for 2020. That is primarily focused on operations. So that is operating our wastewater treatment plants as well as our conveyance systems. Administration is where we see most of our IS and other centralized fees, which is a big piece. Technical service looks smaller than it really is. That's our planning and construction group. And most of their time is actually capitalized. And so that's only about 20% of their expenses. The other 80% is put into or capitalized for the construction work. So they're bigger than they look. And then maintenance is $10 million, keeping our plants and our interceptors operating. And then support services is our lab and our business process improvement, and also where our division-specific IT group sits. And then EQA is the work that we do for monitoring and for water supply and water resources. In terms of by category, you can see our biggest piece is also salaries and benefits. Second largest is contracted services. That's things like PM, program maintenance, and other contracting work that we ask for. And then materials and supplies. That's where you see our chemicals and our utilities for running the plants. RA allocation is the support services we get from the 5th floor. Utilities. I'm sorry, I called it twice. Utilities that's where our energy, mostly gas and electricity, we're one of the top customers for Excel. And then PAYGO is our biggest piece, pay as you go, which again, we're trailing at 11 million. I think the most important thing to know about these pie charts is they look very similar to last year and the year before. So no dramatic shifts in where we plan to spend our money. In terms of sources, again, you can see municipal wastewater charges is our biggest piece at 87%. SAC is not on this chart because this only looks at our operating piece, and SAC only pays for debt. So it's important. This will be different than what our customers are used to seeing when we say 235. So again, that's because the remainder of the wastewater fees go towards debt. So our total wastewater fee is 235, but only 155 goes towards operating. Industrial fees at 8%, and then other is pass-through grants and other interest earnings. And then our reserve is where we ran a surplus in 2018, and we like to get that money back to our customers as soon as possible. And so we have deliberately planned a deficit, and we use the reserves to cover the difference. In terms of our debt and our outstanding debt for our capital, you can see that we do have 1.3 billion in 2018. That is the peak. That's our highest moment, and that will be coming down, and that is partially what is driving then the decrease in our debt service bubble. The other thing that's driving it is during the recession, we were looking for ways to keep our costs low for the region while it was in a recession, and so we pushed some principal payments out into the future, and those principal payments are coming due. But how that relates to the rest of our peer agencies, so 1.3 billion seems a lot, but we are very fortunate here in the Twin Cities that we do not have any consent decrees. So most of the cities that are on the right-hand side are facing consent decrees from the EPA, primarily around combined sewers and sewer system overflows. We have a separated system, so we do not have a consent decree from the EPA. And a consent decree usually mandates that you spend a certain amount up to, well, it can be 10, 15, $20 billion over the next 10 years. So we do not have such a decree, so we are able to keep our debt per capita at a low rate. And with that, I will stand for any questions.
So are consent decrees, I assume then like Boston, the ones in the higher prices have those, so they're mandated? Are they mandates?
Madam Chair, that is correct. It's usually around, again, eliminating combined system overflows, sewer system overflows. There's two ways to deal with it. You can either separate your systems or you can build giant underground tanks. And I'm not sure what Boston is doing, but that is what DC has done. That is what Chicago has done. And I believe that's what Cincinnati will be doing.
Well, I would not take the sign of no questions as a bad thing. I think I mean, you guys are very concise about what you're doing, and you have your fees and you put it out and you're keeping things low. So thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Appreciate it. And I think that brings us to transportation. And we'll have them go next. So we're doing pretty good. I think this is the last department, but the biggest, I think, in terms of, let's see. So, welcome to the council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the budget and the bulk of the information will be provided by Ed and Heather. So just as a brief introduction, you all know that we are facing structural deficit in our transportation budget. And so because we're facing a structural deficit, the budget you're going to be seeing is by and large a maintain current services budget. People, we understand the dependence that people have on transit, the reliance that they have, and we're trying to maintain reliability while we face future budget pressures. 70% of our budget is driven by our service plan. In other words, 70% of our budget is directly tied to keeping approximately 130 routes in place to serve 90 cities. Those direct cost centers include operators, mechanics, parts, fuel. All that's driven almost by formula. If we have this many routes in place, it drives these costs, and that becomes part of our budget. That 70% does not include other fixed operational obligations, such as the cost to maintain facilities like 16 maintenance and administrative buildings, 12,000 bus stops, nearly 1,000 shelters, 24 transit centers, 44 rail platform stations, 76 parking rides, 10 parking ramps. You get the idea that we have a lot of property. In fact, I was told today, and I'll just trust them, that we have approximately 5 million square feet of commercial property to maintain. So it's a big job keeping. This is also keeping services on the street. Also, we have the cost of the Metro Transit Police Department, and then, as Mary mentioned, there's the cost of support operations, finance, HR, IT, procurement, which is not a small amount. I think it was around, her chart showed around $44 million being charged to Metro Transit for those support operations on an annual basis. There are some limited exceptions in the Metro Transit budget to a maintenance only budget that drives some new 2020 costs, although these are marginal increases in comparison to the total budget. That includes the annualization of the C-Line costs, as C-Line started in June early June of this year. And of course, we have a half-year expense on C-line for operators, related mechanics and safety, including police officers, and those expenses get annualized in 2020. In addition, I began as the general manager late January, and when I came in, I made some initial investments in improving customer experience. That includes adding. We've been trying to focus our money on our expenditures in the face of a structural deficit on things that our customers really can see and feel and understand are improvements for their experience. That includes adding staff to clean LRV cars at the end of each run. Before, we only had one staff doing that. Now we have up to 8 staff, and we're cleaning rail cars at transit at the Union Depot, and we're cleaning them again at the Target field, and cleaning them again at Mall of America. And I've been hearing people are seeing the difference in the condition of those rail cars. I see it when I ride them, and I know that I've received compliments about the change from others. We're also in the process of adding facilities and maintenance staff to improve our maintenance of platforms, shelters, and stops, and increase our capacity to handle the demands of severe winter weather. My first full month was February. I experienced firsthand what kind of pressure severe weather can put on our system. It hurt our reliability, it hurt our customer satisfaction, and I think that it's a worthwhile investment to try to put ourselves in a better place to handle those situations coming forward. And then also there's some set aside available for police overtime to address hot spots that become apparent throughout the year. I'll mention that in making these investments, in the past, investments have been held back because of the structural deficit. I'm not at all criticizing that. It was an eminent deficit. We had a change in forecast, which pushed the deficit out a couple of years. And frankly, in these decisions I'm making, I've made some decisions to make some investments here that I'm wanting to continue in 2020. That I believe are if we don't make those investments, it's going to hurt our fundamental services, and we're not meeting fundamental expectations of our customers, including our customers who work at the legislature. So I think they're defensible. If we ever come to a point where they're not sustainable, they're primarily in areas where we have types of positions we have higher turnover, and we can back out of those investments as necessary. But the big picture story in this budget is the structural deficit, and frankly, this is the result of receiving one-time appropriations for ongoing cost. For state fiscal year, I'm going to speak state fiscal years because that's how the state appropriations are made. But in state fiscal year 18 and 19, we received $70 million in new appropriations for costs that were presented as ongoing structural costs for running the transit service. Those appropriations were not continued in 2021, thus the structural deficit. And then again, we experienced this last session where for Metro Mobility, they appropriated $36 million for the biennium, but they didn't continue that appropriation to the following biennium. Our total structural deficit is about $113 million. If that $70 million and $36 million were put in the base budget because they are base costs, we'd be about where we need to be in terms of being in structural balance, but we're not. In 22, our current budget spends $40 million in reserves. 14 million of those reserves are reserve drawdown of general reserves. 25 million are MBES reserves. Part of that is planned because we budget only 95% of the MBES forecast to hedge against a bad actual against the forecast, and then we plan to spend that the following year. But the 25 million in MBES reserves, as was pointed out in our Transportation Committee, is beyond the 5% of hedge. It's because we had more MBES revenues than we had originally anticipated, so we're able to apply them to our structural deficit. But if we'd not received those reserves, we would have been spending more general fund reserves. Our general fund reserves right now, according to forecast, are planned to be spent down by the second half of calendar year 2021. That would be state fiscal years 22, 23 is when we start seeing. So we need help from the legislature. That's why we're asking for a sustainable funding source for transit, because right now we're staring at this funding cliff that's going to be occurring in the latter half of 2021. And we're managing this with primary reliance on motor vehicle sales tax. I think people saw the stock market today. There's probably discussions. I heard you had discussions in management committee about potential recession. I don't know what the causes of this is. I'm not an economist. I'm not suggesting that, but it reminds me to tell you that in recession, one of the first expenditures that's not made is buying new cars. So our primary source of funding is probably the first to lower in the early part of recession, and usually the last to come back. If you think about it, it's the big expenditure item. It's a thing you cut back on first. It's a thing you go back to last. And so it's a volatile funding stream, and we have years and years of revenue information to prove that. The other big part of our story is the operator shortage. I won't go into that. We had a committee of the whole presentation on that, but that is certainly a major concern inside our budget, because it is forcing us to, as you know, reduce trips because we can't support them with operators and still have a reliable service. And it's a big part of what we have to solve going into 2020. We're putting a lot of effort into solving that. And then the last thing I'll mention is ridership as our story, that we are continuing to see a decline in bus ridership. I think the information nationally is that that's probably likely driven by Uber, Lyft, bike share, scooters. All those are pressures against bus ridership. Transit agencies across the nation are experiencing that. By the way, they're also experiencing the operator shortage as well. That's not new. It's part of the economy that we're all struggling through. But that's a concern that we have. Where does bus service play in the new mobility system? And as these private mobility systems come forward, how does this impact and degrade bus? And if bus ridership is degraded, then what does that say for people who rely on bus service going forward? So it's a big issue that we need to think about, and it's a big issue that this body, I think, needs to think about as a matter of policy. I will mention that A-line and C-line are bucking the trend. We're showing that premium services that are reliable and that are easy to use and have less stops and faster service are attractive. As you know, we increased on the A-line ridership in that quarter by 33%. The early information on C-line is it's running about the same. We need to look more months into that to see really where that plays out. But it does tell you that premium services are valued, and they do bring us capability of increasing ridership. And then Green Line and Blue Line are increasing are continuing to increase ridership as well. Year to date, Green Line is showing above a 5% increase from year to year, and Blue Line is not increasing in ridership that much, but it's still increasing. North Star's holding primarily steady, but with the bus ridership declining and the Blue and Green Line ridership increasing, the Blue and Green Line ridership now represents almost a third of our total ridership. So we have 130 routes. 2 routes represent about 33% of our rides. So that has a lot of implications in terms of how we look at our services, how we look at maintaining our services, safety, all those sorts of issues come into play when we consider the prominence of the Green Line and Blue Line, our ridership structure. So I know that Nick Thompson could not be here today because he had scheduled annual leave. I'm going to guess that if Nick were to tell you what his big stories were, they would also be the structural deficit, and I imagine So I'm doing that on behalf of Nick Thompson, and I'm going to hand it over to Ed and Heather to finish the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Wes. We know you have your hands full, so we appreciate you just telling it like it is, and I guess we have to figure out how to deal with it, right?
We'll get through it.
Thank you.
You bet.
Good afternoon, Chair, Committee members. Ed Petrie, I'm Director of Finance at Metro Transit.
And Heather Augustin-Hebner, Finance Director for MTS.
We'll go through the details of the budget. The first thing we want to talk about is just some information on the basis for our budget development for the Transportation Division. We're going to go through some of the council policy and actions that they've taken over the last few years and how it's impacting our budget and how we're implementing it. The effects of the Minnesota legislature this past year on our state funding, whether it's motor vehicle sales tax or state appropriations. And then we also do a multi-year financial outlook, and we'll talk about that. One thing I do want to point out that our preliminary budget tonight is based upon information from the legislative session, and it reflects current law motor vehicle sales tax and current law state appropriations. As Mary had probably mentioned earlier too, our motor vehicle sales tax, we get a forecast from the state of Minnesota twice a year, in February and November of each year. The preliminary budget that we're presenting tonight is based upon the February of 2019 forecast. In November, we will receive another forecast right before council adoption in December. So any changes that happen between the February forecast and the November forecast, we will bring forward to the council then in December and inform you the changes that have occurred and or our recommendations for changes in the budget at that time. So moving forward with the development of the budget, the first thing is with the biggest thing is with the service plan for our budget. Our service plan basically drives around 65 to 70% of the budget for Metro Transit. The service plan basically drives our operators, our mechanics, fuel, parts, and supplies. The service plan is adopted based upon the standards that were adopted by the council through the Transportation Policy Plan. All regional transit services is evaluated within this plan, so it includes not only services for Metro Transit, Metropolitan Transportation Services, but also the regional providers. We use the Transportation Policy Plan then to evaluate all services across the region, whether it's express, local, urban local, suburban local, against the standards. And one of the things that we actually do is we actually do an evaluation looking at those routes and looking at, for example, at Metro Transit, we look at the routes that are meeting the standards and routes that are not meeting the standards. We will then look at the routes that are not meeting the standards and say, is there anything we can do to adjust that route to make it perform better? And or should we do what we call normally, it's called harvest and reinvest. We will take those hours of service from that route A and say, well, this route is not performing well, but we've either heard from our customers or other people that we could have additional, or we have overloads on some service where we could then reinvest those dollars from route A into route B. And then we will do that, harvest and reinvest it, keep investing. So that is one of the big bases that are in our budget. Labor agreements is another one. We have multiple unions, whether it's ATU, which is the local 1005, which is our largest union within transportation. That's all of our operators, mechanics, cleaners, parts people. All those people are under the ATU local 1005. We also have our TMSA, the police, we have ASME, we also have non-reps. All of them have labor agreements that have been reviewed at the council and approved by the council and adopted. So all the rates that are within those respective grant or respective contracts for labor agreements are implemented now with this budget. Fare policy review is another big thing. With fare policy, the council sets the regional standards for fare policy across the region. We have a regional fare. The fare is the same whether it's a regional fare, whether it's a light rail, commuter rail, a Metro Transit service, an MTS service, or a suburban transit provider. The same base fare applies to all services. For example, like on North Star, you have the base fare plus a distance surcharge, but the base fare for everybody, express fares, are the same across the region. We also have transfer reciprocity across the region. But the council establishes what the fares are, and based upon our ridership forecasts that we're forecasting, we'll then drive the passenger fares that we're actually going to generate or forecast to generate in the budget. The final thing is our targeted fund balance. The council does have a targeted fund balance for every one of the business units. For the transportation division, our target fund balance ranges from anywhere from about 8.3% to 10%, or technically 1 month's expenses in reserves. And so that is one of the things that we have. And one of the things with the target fund balance, as you could assume, is the fact is that a target fund balance is very good for one-time expenses, one-time issues that you may have. A target fund balance is not there to solve any structural deficit you may have, which I'll talk about in a few moments. We have built our fund balances, purposely built our fund balances with the council's help over the last 3 to 4 years. But one of the things that's going to help us with the structural deficit, but it does not solve our structural deficit that we have. Forecasts in the legislation. First I want to point out that, first of all, our preliminary budget, we review with all of our forecasts and financial plans. We do a number of financial plans and forecasts within the transportation division. First of all, we do what we call, it's a financial outlook plan that we actually look at the current year and forecast that for the next 2 bienniums. We forecast that based upon what we know current expenditures are trending, what we think expenditures are going to be. We apply the rates that are applied within our labor contracts. We will then look at what we've been appropriating from state appropriations. We will then also look at what the forecasts are coming in from the motor vehicle sales tax from the state of Minnesota, put all that information together and forecast and look at ridership trends, forecast that out for not only the current year, but the next 4 years. All that information, we review it. We also look at all that information. We also file financial management plans with the FTA, for example, with the Southwest plan, Botno, all the different BRT lines. We also look at making sure that our budgets, with our forecasts, with the financial plans are all talking together and all saying the same information and using the same information. This past year at the legislature, a big change happened with our state appropriation where they actually, historically, we had a state appropriation for transit operations. We had a base of $89 million. That was for transit operations that could be used for metro mobility, light rail, commuter rail, and if there's anything left for bus operations. A big change that was made at the legislature this past year is that they actually broke the state appropriations, broke it into 2 pieces. One for metro mobility, and then one for transit operations, which is consumed then by light rail and commuter rail. Because of first of all, with the breakage with metro mobility and for transit operations, 100% of the state appropriation now is consumed by metro mobility, light rail, commuter rail. And in a couple slides following this, I will actually detail that information out for you. But as present time right now, there's no state appropriations that go into bus operations. We are totally reliant upon motor vehicle sales tax and, of course, fares. Some of the financial consideration I've already, I guess, that Rose will talk about also is the legislative the future structural deficit, which I'll address that in a few minutes. We have received, as Mr. Koister mentioned too, we have received a lot of one-time funding from the legislature back in 2017, 2018. We went to the legislature, we had a deficit. We received, it was 18-19, excuse me, we received one-time funding of $70 million. That was for that 2 years, it went away. This past legislative session for 2021, we received $36 million for metro mobility. Starting state fiscal year 22, that will go away. Then we'll be back down to our base, having to go back then to the legislature, then in state fiscal year 22, asking for the same money that they had provided for us in prior years as a base amount, or as an additional non-base amount. So one of the challenges that we've had over the many, many years is that we have to continue to go back to the legislature and ask for the one-time appropriations that they had provided. We have to ask for it again. So that is a significant challenge for us. So let's just talk state general fund appropriations. As I mentioned, state general fund appropriations are appropriated by the legislature on a biennial basis. Per legislation, they're set to cover 50% of the net operating assistance for light rail. But that one thing there is in law, though, that does exclude the Metro Green Line extension Southwest. So it can cover current Blue Line operations, current Green Line operations, but we cannot use state general fund appropriations for the Green Line extension Southwest. State general fund funds right now are consumed 100% by Metro Mobility, light rail, commuter rail. There is none for bus operations. And under current rates, which Heather will talk about, under the current path and the current path of growth for Metro Mobility, as of state fiscal year 2022, Metro Mobility, if we do not receive additional state funding in state fiscal year 2022, Metro Mobility will consume 100% of the state general fund. That will mean then there will be no state general fund for light rail operations, no state general fund for commuter rail operations. They will then fall back onto motor vehicle sales tax, taking technically motor vehicle sales tax from bus operations to push up into rail and commuter rail. So that's one of the challenges that we have moving forward into state fiscal year 2022 is that if we do not get this additional one-time money, Metro Mobility will consume 100% state general fund. We will have to use motor vehicle sales tax from bus operations to cover the 50% subsidy on commuter rail and light rail. One of the things we did mention, though, is they did break out this past year. They broke out Metro Mobility on its own portion within the state general fund, which we look at as a council as a very good thing because the Metro Mobility is a federally mandated service. And by breaking that out, it's a recognition that it is a federally mandated service and it's an important service. So we feel as a council that would should help us go back to the legislature this current session. Well, let's just look at the numbers. This is numbers that Wes had mentioned when he talked about state general fund. You can see it's broken down between Metro Mobility, light rail, commuter rail, and bus. So you can see the base amount from Metro Mobility is basically flat between $56 and $57 million a year. We received the one-time money, as Wes had mentioned, of $36 million, broken out between $23 million in 2020 and the balance of $13 million in 2021. You can see starting in 2022 thereafter, Metro Mobility has its base. And as Heather will talk about, Metro Mobility has significant growth forecasted in all those years. So $36 million is gone. Their growth continues to move up. There is no additional state funding to cover that. One of the other things that's interesting in this chart, if you look, light rail, commuter rail, light rail has a flat amount at $25.5 million. Commuter rail is flat at $7.15 million. Based upon these amounts, it assumes no inflation. So which is the other challenge. We all know we have inflation. We have base inflation in our budgets. Light rail and commuter rail have flat. So if they have anything in excess of a 0% inflation, state general fund will not cover it. It will then have to come from motor vehicle sales tax. I feel like I'm just telling you gloom tonight. It's the reality, so we're telling you. It will have to come from motor vehicle sales tax, which currently funds bus operations.
That's historically a fight at the legislature about inflation and for education, for everything, right? That it just doesn't exist in a lot of ways.
It doesn't exist.
But it does, right?
But it does, exactly.
Right, yeah.
So Madam Chair, that's where I feel like this chart really illustrates. The point is the fact that we're looking at flat funding for light rail and commuter rail. But we all know there's inflation. So that's one of the challenges. So let's talk motor vehicle sales tax. Motor vehicle sales tax, as we talked about, we do get a forecast twice a year, every February and every November. The budget we're presenting again this evening is based upon the February forecast. When we receive the forecast in November, before council final adoption of the budget, we will revise the budget and let you know what the changes were. As Wes had mentioned, motor vehicle sales tax is a very volatile revenue source. It can change, which my next slide will talk about the change that can happen to us. One of the other things that we've also noticed with motor vehicle sales tax, the council went on motor vehicle sales tax in 2008. Prior to 2008, the transportation division or transit operations were funded by real estate taxes. 2008, they switched to SOAR to motor vehicle sales tax. One of the things that we've noticed with motor vehicle sales tax is it is also a leading indicator of what's happening with the economy, or there's changes in the economy, as Wes had mentioned. One of the first things you're going to do is in your personal household is the fact that if the economy starts 800 points down today with the stock market, things are going to start happening. People may start questioning whether or not I'm going to buy that vehicle. And that is one of the challenges that we have. As you'll see on the following slide, it's around 44% of our subsidy comes from motor vehicle sales tax. So we're very reliant upon that revenue source. One of the other things that we always kind of talk about, it's a very interesting revenue source to be on, because the picture of the revenue source for me as a finance person is that we want the consumer to go buy a very large SUV, park it in the garage, pay the sales tax, and join us on Metro Transit. So that's one of the challenges. It's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek, but that's one of the challenges with this revenue source when we were brought onto this revenue source. As a result of the budget risk that we talked about with the volatility, the council made the decision back in 2008. We budget 95% of it. So when we receive the state of Minnesota forecast, we budget 95% of the forecast because of the uncertainty of what could happen between February and November. Anything we receive in addition or up and above that 95% goes into a motor vehicle sales tax reserve to be then available for operations the next year. Well, let's just look at a pictorial of what happened a few years ago. And I don't know if you can see that the two lines I'm really interested in you seeing is a very top dotted line, it's a red line. Then you see down the bottom line is a kind of a peach colored line. Why I'm pointing out those two lines is the fact is the red line was the February 2017 forecast. The peach line was the November 2017 forecast. When we get the forecast, we get it for a 4-year period. Between those two forecasts, February and November, motor vehicle sales tax dropped $111 million. So one of the things, we get motor vehicle sales tax collections every single month. And before we received the November forecast, we knew it was going down because within the finance division, we watch our receipts every single month very closely. And as a result of the forecast receipts coming in up or down, we also then look back into our financial outlook, our 4-year plan, and start having discussions about what potentially could be coming. So before we received the November 17 forecast, we knew the forecast was going down. So as a result, we started purposely in 2017 at Metro Transit and MTS, we started purposely building reserves because we knew motor vehicle sales tax was, I don't want to use the word tanking, but we knew it was going to tank. But we didn't know to what level. So we purposely started doing cost containment. I use a term like harvest and non-reinvest. We started looking at some of our services that were not performing according to regional standards. We started harvesting some of that service, not reinvesting it and saving the dollars. We also then looked at like short-term savings we can make, like with cost containment with salaries, as far as not filling positions, and then different types of things that we could do to save. And we started to build reserves because we knew there was a cliff coming. But we also knew that we needed to be part of the solution.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question on the motor vehicle sales tax. And again, thinking at the historical record, when we had the recession last time, 2006, 2007, 2008, in this slide, we have a drop of about a third in the revenues between the projected and the actual.
Mm-hmm.
How steep was the actual drop between the projections and the actual back then? So if we have a recession, will be a 1/3 drop in what we expect? Will be 90%? What will be the ballpark based on historical experience of how much less money we're going to get?
Chair, committee members, I don't have that information, but we can go back into the archives and find it. Like I mentioned, the transportation division, we went on to motor vehicle sales tax in 2008, which was after the recession. Okay. When we came on it, the economy is coming out of the recession, motor vehicle sales tax is moving up. But we can go back and see if we can find some information and report back to the council as far as what happened during that recession time. Very good question.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Please proceed.
The other thing I talked about a few minutes ago also is that our tracking our financial outlook. Like I said, we do a 5-year, basically a 5-year look at our finances. We look at not only the current year, but for the next 4 years, the next 2 bienniums. We base this based upon current law state funding. We use the most recent motor vehicle sales tax forecast, which we update twice a year and also at the end of a legislative session. We detail all of our funding expense assumptions and use the reserves. And as I mentioned too, we had built reserves over the past few years, starting in 2017, as a result of the financial cliff that we were noticing within our structural position. This kind of gives you a pictorial of what Wes had mentioned earlier. This is the structural cliff kind of in some very simple lines, but it pretty well paints a picture of what we're talking about. First of all, this is based upon the 2020 proposed budget and the February 19 invest forecast. And it's based on state fiscal years 19 through 23. So I'll take you row by row here. First of all, the first one is base revenue for operations. That is our base revenue based on our assumptions for motor vehicle sales tax from the state, current law state appropriations, our forecast based on passenger fares, advertising revenue, all those items, revenue that we're getting for our subsidies from the counties for the rail lines. That's all in our base revenues. Operating expenses are the operating expenses for the entire transportation division. That would include the Metro Transit bus, light rail, commuter rail, Metropolitan Transportation Services family, which would include all the MTS, planning, contracted services, Metro Mobility. That's all in our base operation expenses. That brings us to a final structural position. So you can see, for example, in state fiscal year 2019, we had a structural deficit of $41 million. We mentioned earlier that in 18 and 19, we had gone to the legislature and informed them we had the structural deficit coming. They provided one-time funding of $70 million. We used $30 million of that in state fiscal year 18. The balance of $40 million in state fiscal year 19. We used $2 million of reserves with that. We were balanced in 2019. 2020, start with the straight 2020, we have a straight structural deficit of $43 million. We have discussed that we received $36 million of one-time money for Metro Mobility. That's broken out. $23 million goes into 2020, $13 million into 2021. So with state fiscal year 2020, you use the one-time state money. We're using $20 million of reserves that we began to build back in 2017. We're going to use $20 million of those reserves. We'll balance ourselves in state fiscal year 20. Same story as state fiscal year 21. We'll have the one-time state appropriation money for Metro Mobility. We're going to forecast to use $35 million of our reserves. Basically brings us down to basically a structural position of -1. So it's basically zero. So right now through state fiscal year 21, with the one-time state money and the use of our reserves that we purposely built, we can see ourselves balanced through state fiscal year 2021. But now here the fiscal cliff comes, starting in state fiscal year 22. We have a structural position, negative position of $59 million. We have $12 million of reserves left. As we talked about earlier, we have a reserve minimum of 8.3 to 10%. We have $12 million of reserves left above that minimum. We will spend down those reserves. We have a remaining structural deficit of $47 million in state fiscal year 22. No reserves left in 23. We have a state fiscal year deficit of $65 million in 23. So that's our $112 million structural deficit that will be going to the legislature the next session. As Wes had mentioned, if they had continued the one-time funding of the state of the $70 million and the one-time funding of the Metro Mobility dollars, that would virtually cover the deficit in 22 and 23. So we'll have to go back now to the legislature and ask for the one-time money that they had provided again.
Yeah, but what we really want is a long-term funding source, like a regional sales tax, which we asked for.
That's correct.
They didn't entertain that thought, but perhaps in the future we could get something steady when they start to understand the story of what could happen. But Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Petrie, I have a question about the practice of harvesting and what do you say, harvesting?
We use the term harvest and reinvest.
Okay, yeah. So, that's so my question about equity is, how do you decide which positions are worthy of not refilling or replacing? Because from an equity standpoint, I'd be concerned about, let's say, what if the position interfaces with the disability community or as an outreach role? What do you have and I'm sure, there are some decisions that staff have the discretion over, and that's totally fine with me too, but I wonder if you have an equity analysis about what positions get refilled or not.
Chair Kunemers, I don't have that information available with me now, but I can have that. I can provide information back to the council. But I do know they go through an equity lens when they're looking at, I think you're talking about like which rich routes or whatever we may harvest and where we may reinvest it. I believe that's what you're referring to. And I don't have that information, but I can provide it.
To the regional administrator?
If I can clarify, Madam Chair, our harvest and reinvest is targeted at our service. So we're looking at an underperforming bus route that maybe doesn't have much ridership, and then we're pulling that bus route off the street. So it's not so much targeted at administrative staff. Certainly, if there's not a bus route, there's not an operator on that route, but because we've chronically been short operators, we're not losing any operators. I don't know if the general manager.
Thank you. Really important question because it plays to the exercise that you were going through with respect to values on service development, service delivery. And in a time with constrained resources, we have to make decisions on what services we provide and what services we don't provide. Our traditional way of evaluating that are certain service standards. It's based upon ridership on types of service, and it's really we measured things like ridership per vehicle hour, rides per vehicle hour. We measured things like subsidy per passenger subsidy, and all those things get taken into consideration. There are value structure behind that this council may agree with or may not agree with. That's part of the exercise of placing transit values on how we appropriate services. But no value structure gets the benefit of not having ignoring limits in funding. So those are hard decisions that have to be made. And I wanted to raise that because that question hits right to that point. How do we make decisions about reducing services in times of fiscal constraint is really a value sort of overall policy question, not on a route-to-route basis, but in an overall framework of how we go about approaching those questions.
Thank you.
Right, and just so you know, our friends in the legislature that are, some are trying to fund us and some it's more challenging, but if their route gets cut in their area, I'll tell you, I get calls, and so do many of you, about why, and then they're basing it on these formulas, and then so you get the human element in there, right? What's going to happen, and these are my folks, and they're elected, and so it brings a lot of interesting dynamics on how do you control when you have a shrinking system. So it's difficult. So hopefully we can grow it. We just need the money. So if we could all go up there and ask for the money, it sounds so easy, doesn't it? But it's tough. Mr. Petrie.
And Meredith, thank you for clarifying the question. Okay, talking about the budget framework. As we've discussed, we have our parameters within our budget development. We look at motor vehicle sales tax, state appropriations, fares. It's all based upon what current law. The service on the street is based upon our transportation policy plan standards. We have metro mobility expansion to Lakeville, which Heather will talk about. Wes had already talked about, we do have some 2019 customer service improvements that are going to be annualizing in 2020. Some of the improvements are improving customer communications, which would include adding 3 staff to our transit control center to support real-time rider alerts for service departure changes, social media notifications and alerts, and text for safety. On the improving conditions of our train stations and other facilities, we're adding a total of 16 staff to clean trains and maintain our facilities. On security, we're looking at enhancing security in our trains and in our transit stations by building on security enhancements that we have previously made, and enhancing LRT enforcement, and also enhancing or increasing our patrol officer focus on trains and buses. One of the things that we'll talk about in a few minutes is ridership. Some of the challenges, as Wes had mentioned too, light rail ridership, commuter rail ridership we're seeing about a 5% growth. We're forecasting a 5% growth also now in the budget for next year. Commuter rail ridership, we're forecasting a 1% growth for ridership in the budget for next year. Our biggest challenge, if I were to say the biggest challenge for Metro Transit right now, it's bus ridership. Bus ridership is down 5% this year from the prior year. So we're actually forecasting a 5% decline in ridership for next year based on current trends. That means about 2.9 million rides, or about a $4 million impact to our budget. So that is one of if I were to say the one thing that concerns me the biggest or largest right now in the Metro Transit budget, it is bus ridership.
So on the flip side of that, the biggest concern on the MTS side is METMO ridership, but for the exact opposite reason. Ridership is going up. It continues to go up. So as a reminder, Metro Mobility provides transit service per person certified under the ADA who cannot use regular fixed route buses due to a disability or health condition. Service is provided by private vendors under contract with MTS. So I know all of you have been briefed about METMO over the past few months, but before we get in the budget details, I thought it would be helpful for a quick review of the scope and scale of the program. The service model of Metromobility is designed to meet state and federal rules. That means we have significantly less flexibility to adjust our program than other council transit service. The service has grown disproportionately to other transit services in the region. Between 2013 and 2018, ridership grew 30%. We now have in the neighborhood of 62,000 certified riders. The ridership growth is significant because each bus typically only carries 1 or 2 passengers at any given time. This means our budget increases because we have to have more buses out there. By contrast, if you're on a fixed route, if you're seeing an articulated bus or a 40-foot bus or the 30-foot standard buses out, they cost the same to run, whether you have 10 people board or 50 people board. Metromobility service is just not designed that way. So as you see ridership increase, we need more buses and we need to have more cost to operate. So that's a preview. We'll be back to talk to you about our capital budget later this fall, but Metromobility ridership growth is having a significant impact on our capital budget as well. So we face a number of challenges, all of which put pressure on our budget. These include rising demand as our population in the region ages and general wage pressure of our drivers driven by market conditions. We do have a handful of new initiatives I'd like to highlight. The first is that we will be expanding service to Lakeville to comply with this year's legislative session. This service will add roughly $1 million in annual expenses to the Metromobility operating budget and require the purchase of 9 additional buses. The other new initiative I'd like to highlight implement key recommendations from the Metromobility Task Force. As a reminder, the task force was established during the 2017 special legislative session and had 2 primary goals. These included identifying options to increase program efficiency and effectiveness and to minimize program costs and improve service, including potential partnership with taxi service providers and transportation network companies. So the Council and the Department of Human Services are working to share certain data in order to coordinate special transportation services between the agencies. There is the potential to draw down federal money to help fund some transportation services with Metromobility, including folks that are involved with day training and habilitation, senior daycare programs, and other non-emergency medical transportation and other waivered services. However, before we can figure out what kind of program we might be able to develop, we need to understand the population base that would be eligible. DHS has been interested in this for years. Metromobility has been interested in this in years, and it wasn't until this last recent legislative session that we have the permission to share data. So you're not going to see any budgetary impacts of this in our 2020 budget, but it may impact revenues in 2021 and beyond, and you'll hear more about that as that work continues. The second initiative I'd like to highlight is we're working to implement an on-demand service pilot. The major component of the service operation is that we will offer an on-demand, one-seat ride similar to the experience of taking a Lyft or Uber for all Metromobility customers. The pilot provides options for existing customers who may not need the level of service provided by the regular route Metromobility base system. By adding this as a service option, we'll create a more diversified system that has the potential to expand consumer choice, improve base system capacity, and reduce the average cost per trip. A key goal of the pilot is to explore the service market potential and examine the overall impacts on ridership, program cost, and customer service. We anticipate that many riders will be able to make good use of this service, and therefore rides will shift from the more costly Metromobility system. This could result in an overall reduction in our program's per cost ride. So it's in development, and stay tuned. This chart represents the MTS ridership over time. And as a reminder, the MTS family of services includes Metromobility, contracted fixed route. So our contracted fixed route looks like other 40-foot or 30-foot Metro Transit buses that you'll see on the road. You'll never know which ones are ours. So everything is branded so our customers have a seamless experience. It includes TransitLink Dial Ride service, the Metro Red Line, the region's first BRT, and Metro Van Pool. So there's a couple trends I'd like to highlight here. The first is that Metromobility, represented in blue, continues to grow, and that growth puts pressure on our budget. Right now, the 2020 budget assumes a 6.2 ridership growth on Metromobility. If there's anything likely to have a significant change in our budget that we're suggesting for you now versus later in the year, it's likely to do with Metromobility ridership. As a general rule of thumb, a 1% change in Metro Mobility ridership is about $750,000. So it's one thing we track really, really closely, and we may be coming back to you later in the year recommending a change. The second trend I'd like to call it is our contracted fixed route in yellow. Our ridership ebbs and flows depending upon which and how many routes we are asked to provide. The number increases and decreases based on the council's overall service plan. In 2020, we are currently forecasting flat ridership in our contracted service routes, and that's primarily because some routes that were previously operated under Metro Transit will now have a full year of service under MTS, but our base bus ridership is really experiencing the same story that Ed talked to you about with the Metro Transit ridership. The third item I'd like to call it is the Metro Red Line. That's indicated by the red line, and for obvious reasons. I call that out just because it was the region's first BRT line, and then that continues to move forward, and we're anticipating that will have relatively flat ridership.
Okay, then the next chart is on the Metro Transit ridership. We're forecasting a budget next year of 79.7 million rides. You can see Green Line is forecasted to come in at 14.2 million rides. North Star at just over 810,000 rides, 11.3 million on Blue Line. The challenge, once again, as we discussed, is on the bus system. Our bus system this year, our budget is 56.3. We're forecasting to take it down 2.9 million rides, about 5%, down to 53.4 million rides for next year. So now we get to the fun part of the presentation, which is the numbers. Our overall transportation budget is a $622 million budget. On the uses by department, you can see on the left-hand side, the largest portion is Metro Transit Bus. Our operation is about $358 million. The transit capital portion is $23 million. That's for Metro Transit staff that actually work on capital projects. For example, people that work on the Southwest project or the new Minneapolis bus garage when we build it. Their salaries we pay for with capital funds, but we do track their expenses here. Light rail, which is the blue and the green, $84 million. Commuter rail, which is North Star, just over a $20 million budget. Metro Mobility is in at $94 million. Then you have the planning at $8.8 million and contracted services at just over $31 million. As you would imagine, on the uses on the right-hand side, we're a very labor-intensive organization. Our services are either done through salaries and benefits, otherwise contracted services on the MTS side, but you can see that is the largest portion of our budget. Fuel, diesel fuel, we are the largest consumer of diesel fuel in the state of Minnesota. We consume about 7.5 million gallons of diesel fuel on an annualized basis. We're the largest consumer, $29 million budget. Regional allocations, that's the support we receive from regional allocation or from regional support. That would include human resources, IS, payroll, all those types of services, diversity, equity, all those types of services that we share across the council. Other costs would include all the other expenses, which would include utilities, insurance, advertising, supplies, bus parts, all the other peripheral expenses. The sources of revenue for the transportation division, $622 million. You can see state revenues comprise about 66% of our budget. 47% of our total budget, which was motor vehicle sales tax, is 47%. State general funds, about 19% of our budget. The federal funds, we bring those in to pay for the capital salaries. We have fares in at 18%. The local money, the local funding at $38 million, that is funding that we receive from the respective counties for the subsidies on light rail and commuter rail. That would be funding from the counties of, for example, on the Blue Line, that would be Hennepin County. Green Line would be Hennepin County and Ramsey County, and North Star would be Hennepin County, Anoka County, and Sherburne County and MnDOT, paying for North Star. So that is all the local funding. Reserves, as we discussed, we have a planned use of reserves next year according to our plan. And other revenues, $7.5 million. The lion's share of that would be advertising. You see all of our trains and all of our buses wrapped in advertising. Very lucrative for us. It'll bring in about $7 million in revenues next year. And with that, Chair, I believe that is our last slide on transportation. And Taylor and I would stand for any additional questions.
Well, thank you. So how do we compare with the other systems? I guess we don't, ours is a little different, but is this happening nationally? Are these the trends? Bus ridership is down and
Yes.
revenues. I mean, I assume we're sort of in there. I know that one of the things is sometimes state legislatures support, obviously, they're supporting the systems more.
Yep.
And especially light rail and different things. So,
Madam
any
Chair.
comments? Yeah.
Yeah,
just
Madam
where do
Chair, a
we
couple of
fit?
things I would just say. First of all, is the trends as far as for ridership across the United States. We're in constant contact with APTA, which is the American Public Transit Association. Ridership trends on bus systems across the United States are down about 4 to 5%. So not that that's positive, but we're right in line with everybody else. One of the other things that you did touch on though is we actually do every year we do peer comparisons through the NTD report, National Transit Database report. We file all of our information with NTD to receive our federal funding so we can buy buses, buy trains, build shelters, those types of items. But with the filing of that information, we also get a report from the FTA that then tells us how every other agency is doing. We always compare ourselves. We have a number of 13 agencies on the bus side, 10 agencies on the rail side that we compare ourselves to. Generally, with our peers on the rail side, we're normally within the top 10 to 15% on peers. On the bus system right now, we're basically right in the middle of the peers. We do compare ourselves to our peers on an annualized basis.
And
Go ahead.
And if I could add, Metro Transit, or excuse me, Metro Mobility usually compares very favorably nationally also.
Yeah, you've got to think of states that have these. I mean, we think we have an aging population. I think of Florida and California, Arizona. I mean, there's got to be massive expenditures happening. Well, I think everybody's. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Tired.
We'll go. I guess we'll go Lindstrom, Gonzalez, Atlas, Ingridson. Sorry, I'm out of order here. You first. We go the other way. Cummings. Go ahead.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I didn't quite fully understand the pilot program. So that's where someone's going to be able to take a direct door-to-door ride using the Metro Mobility bus. Is that correct? So it's going to be Lyft, Uber-ish.
Madam Chair, council members, I am going to ask Christine to step up if she would.
Heather, I don't know your last name, so I'm.
Oh, sorry, it's Augustine Heapner.
Augustine.
Augustine Heapner.
Okay.
And Heather works great.
Okay. We'll just do that because. Welcome.
My name is Christine Kennan. I'm the Senior Manager of Metro Mobility. The pilot program is to offer a ride on an on-demand ride-hailing service like Uber or Lyft. Made a presentation to the Transportation Committee about it in June. It is not a door-to-door. It is not a special transportation services kind of system. It is basically taking an on-demand ride on an Uber or Lyft. That ride is subsidized by the council, much in the same way that the current taxi model is. So right now we have a taxi contract where the customer can book a ride on the taxi service and receive a $15 subsidy. They pay the first $5 of the ride. Customer pays the first $5 of the ride. Council pays the next $15 of the ride, and then the customer pays any $20. So our exposure is capped at $15 a ride, regardless of the cost of the taxi ride. That's available to any Metro customer who chooses to use that kind of service. But we don't manage the service in the same way we would our other contractor providers. They're basically taking the taxi ride under the rules of the taxi industry, and that's the pilot that we have an RFP on the street for to receive services with a transportation network or other like on-demand service provider that can offer the same experience. So it would be the same model, a capped exposure at $15, and we'll be examining whether or not that takes ridership away from our core system, and therefore will be an overall net gain for us, or whether we're building a new ridership model and then improving our ridership or improving mobility, but not necessarily reducing costs on our system. We don't know, so that's what the pilot is for. Does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just have a question about the structural deficit of Metro Mobility, and I'm thinking that now that we have Metro Mobility's budget separated out, so we can see or the legislature can see how much that particular program is costing, would that also present an opportunity to have the legislature dedicate a permanent source of funding just to address that? A sales tax, for example, like it was discussed, or some other way in which the legislature can see that these are disabled and elderly folks, so perhaps that would be a more attractive population to have a dedicated funding source, and that solve that issue. I mean, if is that part of the discussion?
Ms. Bogey.
Madam Chair and council members, we think it was a really big win for us to get a separate appropriation line for Metro Mobility because it makes the legislature face that deficit separate from funding the rest of our transit operations. And so they have to make a decision, not that they're going to fund transit operations and we make the decision how we split it, but that they're making a decision specifically about funding that service. That service is federally mandated, and beyond federal mandate, we have state statute that brings it even beyond the federal mandate. So we believe very strongly that the service should be funded by the state and probably appropriately in the state general.
Excuse me.
The state also is on the hook for 50% of the funding of the light rail operations that are currently in operation. So the current green line and the current blue line. That also is in statute. So when Ed talked about Metro Mobility consuming the whole appropriation, we know that we have to put money to light rail first because it's in statute. Second would be to Metro Mobility because it's mandated service, and commuter rail then and the bus system then would suffer. And so getting this separation really forces that conversation to be around a stable funding source, likely the general fund for Metro Mobility, and then let's talk about the stable funding source for light rail and the bus system, and really putting discussion about, again, the motor vehicle sales tax and the vulnerability of that being the funding source. And we were just talking in the management committee earlier today too about potential recession and what impact that could have on the forecast and what our structural deficit might look like. And so that's another discussion for us to frame our discussion with the legislature on is the forecast is this and it's the truth until it isn't. But what happens if there's a 5% reduction in that motor vehicle sales tax? What then happens to our deficit? How much bigger does it get? We have some control over our budget because, of course, we could raise fares, we could do some administrative adjustments, but there is no way with fare increases and administrative adjustments we can make up that funding gap.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
I just wanted to clarify, and I think this is right, but I was looking through my notes and I couldn't find it, that BRT ridership is performing really well compared to regular bus service, where they're, I mean, it's newer too, but that ridership is trending up. That line is trending up.
Yep, Chair, committee member, that is very correct. That's one of the things that Wes had mentioned earlier. That's one of the things, contrary to our normal bus service, the BRT lines are performing very, very well. It's more of a dedicated service, more of an on-time service, and yeah, it's performing very well.
I just wanted to make sure that was
very nice point. Thank you.
Not getting lumped in into.
Yeah, thank you. Very good point.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Quick question. So if we're up RFP on the on-demand service, are we thinking that we may launch that pilot? Is the intention to launch it in 2020?
Heather?
Madam Chair, council members, I'm going to look to Christine again. I don't know the specific implementation date.
Christine?
Yeah, Madam Chair, council members, that is the intent. The RFP, their proposals are due August 30th, so we read proposals, and if there's a proposal that is advantageous to the council, then proceed on the project.
Great, thank you.
Hello?
Thank you. A different question. So we talk about the buses generally carrying only 1 or 2 passengers, Metro buses. Is the size of the bus mandated? I mean, why do we have such large buses that carry only 1 or 2 people?
Heather?
Madam Chair, council members, I can speak at a high level, and then if you're looking for more detail, I may ask Christine to come back up. There's federal regulations about how those services need to happen and how long clients can be on the bus and how many stops that they can make. So it's really just, it's about as effective as we can be, and meeting federal regulations is having a 1 or maybe 2 people max on a bus at any given time. And if you'd like more detail, I'm sure Christine would be happy to step back up.
Okay, that's good.
Thank you.
I think, I think for all of you, when I was a legislator and we went into a recession and we had to cut things, those are the really hard discussions. We went over and over and over what we're going to cut. And, so it's just like our family budgets. There's so much income, there's so much expense. So do you raise the income or do you cut the expenses? And this is a massive budget, to think about all those kinds of things. But hopefully the legislature comes through. But, if there's less money, guess what they're doing? They're cutting. And so they're cutting, and then we're trying to get more money just like every other agency is, and then the whole thing. So it could be a very interesting time, but maybe it's a time for innovation. Maybe there's a time for different business models, like they're trying, right? I mean, you guys are ahead of us, right, by far, and been doing this a long time. So I think we have to be positive, yet we gotta sell, right? Why it's important that we need funding, and I think to your point, the Metro Mobility change helps do that. So I guess it's 7:00. Is there anything else? Good discussion. You're going to give us a
last
summation.
slide here to wrap us up, Madam Chair.
Yep.
And again, thank you for your attention through this marathon of a presentation. Again, we'll be asking you at your next meeting to adopt a preliminary operating budget of $1.2 billion. Again, that budget can change between now and the time we adopt it. It can move between items. The only thing that can't change is the maximum amount of our total levy, and our total levy that we are asking you to adopt is $88.7 million. That's a 2% increase. Again, we are maximizing our levy in rural communities and general purposes. That 2% is really falling into our debt service as well. So the $8.7 million, $1.2 billion budget, and we'll ask you next week to adopt.
Great. Thank you. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded.
Fourth.
To adjourn. Oh.